Aya, a 22-year-old girl with shining eyes and a shock of thick curls, is the epitome of determination and confidence. She lives in a large metropolis where every day is a challenge. Being an African American, she knows well what it means to overcome difficulties and stereotypes, but it only hardened her. Aya studies at the university at the Faculty of Law, dreaming of becoming a lawyer and defending the rights of those who are not heard. Her passion for justice knows no bounds, and she is ready to sacrifice everything for the sake of her beliefs. However, despite the external determination and strength, Aya feels an emptiness inside that she cannot cope with. She is surrounded by a lot of people, but it seems to her that no one really understands her. She feels lonely in the midst of a bustling city, and this emptiness is gradually growing like a snowball. Her days are filled with studies, work and social activities, but nights are the time when she is alone with her thoughts and fears. Sometimes she wonders why, despite everything she has achieved, her heart continues to feel this uncertainty. Perhaps her problem is that she has never found someone who could fill her inner world. Her relationships with men have always been unsuccessful. They admired her strength and independence, but no one tried to look behind that mask and see a vulnerable girl who needed someone who would understand her and accept her for who she was. Lucas, Aya's older brother, has always been a pillar of support for her. They had been inseparable since childhood, and this fraternal sisterly union was a source of strength for both of them. Lucas is a man who has always known what he wants from life. He chose the profession of an engineer and achieved success in it, working for one of the leading technology companies in the city. At the age of 25, he already held a good position and made ambitious plans for the future. Lucas was someone who always knew how to look at the world with optimism. He was ready to support Aya in her wildest endeavors and always knew how to cheer her up in difficult moments. They shared everything with each other, from joys to sorrows, from the smallest secrets to the most intimate thoughts. As children, they spent a lot of time together playing, dreaming about the future, sharing plans. Aya remembers how Lucas, being older and braver, always protected her from bullies at school and helped her cope with difficulties. He taught her what it means to be strong, but at the same time to be able to open up and trust. Over time, their relationship only strengthened. Aya could call Lucas at any time of the day or night, and he always found time for her, was always ready to listen and support. They grew up together, but despite the different directions in their careers and lives, they always stayed on the same wavelength. However, lately, Aya has begun to notice that her feelings for Lucas have begun to change. At some point, she caught herself thinking that she was thinking of him not only as a brother. She was overcome with excitement at the very thought of meeting him. She began to see in him not only a protector and a friend, but also a man who could not be overlooked. This new sensation made her feel confused and scared. She knew that it was wrong, that it was contrary to all moral norms, but her heart still reached out to him. One day they were sitting together in a small cafe, enjoying a cup of coffee after a hard day. Lucas was talking enthusiastically, but Aya couldn't focus on his words. Her mind wandered, returning to what she had felt recently. A storm of contradictions raged inside her.
Aya, are you even listening to me?
His voice pulled her out of her thoughts. He looked at her with a slight smile, but there was concern in his eyes.
I'm sorry, Lucas, I was thinking a little. She was slightly embarrassed, feeling her heart beat faster.
Are you okay? You've been kind of distant lately.
He leaned closer, trying to catch her eye.
Has something happened?
No, it's okay.
She tried to keep calm in her voice.
I've just been thinking a lot about life, you know how it is.
You always think too much.
He chuckled slightly, but his gaze remained serious.
If something bothers you, you can tell me. You know, I'm always there.
I know,
she replied softly, not daring to look up. Her inner world was in turmoil, and she didn't know how to deal with these new, frightening feelings. Lucas looked at his sister, trying to figure out what was going on inside her. He felt that something had changed, but he couldn't figure out what it was. Aya sat there, torn between the desire to tell everything and the fear of how he would react. The silence between them was becoming more and more tense, and she didn't know if she would ever be able to overcome this barrier. This moment was the beginning of a long inner journey for her, where she had to deal with what she was feeling and how it would affect their relationship. Aya had never thought of her relationship with Lucas as anything more than just a sibling bond. For her, he has always been a support, friend and mentor who helped her in the most difficult situations. But everything changed one day when something happened that turned her perception of their relationship upside down. It was a typical day when Aya was heading home after classes at the university. She was lost in her thoughts about the upcoming exams when she suddenly felt someone's eyes on her. Looking back, she noticed an unfamiliar man who was following her. His intense and cheeky gaze instantly alarmed her. The man accelerated his pace, catching up with her, and began to make unpleasant comments that became more and more offensive. Aya felt her heart beat faster with fear. She tried to quicken her pace, but the stranger was not far behind. He grabbed her hand and it made her stop. At that moment she wanted to disappear, but instead she tried to stay calm and free herself from his grip as quickly as possible.
Please let me go,
she said, trying to sound confident, although her voice trembled slightly. But the man wasn't going to let her go. He grinned impudently, gripping her hand even tighter, and began to mutter something that made her blood boil. Aya felt that her strength wasn't enough to handle him on her own. And then, as if by chance or fate, Lucas was there. He saw the situation from afar and immediately rushed to help. There was anger in his eyes that Aya had never seen before. Running up, he abruptly pushed the stranger away, forcing him to let go of his sister. Lucas was seething with rage inside, but he tried to keep himself in check for Aya's sake.
Get your hands off her.
Lucas's voice was low and menacing, and he stood between Aya and the stranger like a wall. The man clearly did not expect such a turn, and seeing the determination in Lucas's eyes, quickly retreated. Aya, still trembling from the experience, looked at her brother, who stood in front of her, protecting her. At that moment, she realized how much he was important to her. She used to take his protection for granted, as a matter of course. But now, when she saw his anger and determination, a completely different feeling came over her. Something had changed inside Aya. She looked at Lucas, and for the first time her heart began to beat differently. There was more than just gratitude in that look. It was something deeper, something that scared her, and at the same time attracted her. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear, but from that new sensation that she couldn't understand. Something in her had changed forever, and she couldn't ignore it anymore. Lucas approached Aya, seeing her condition, and gently put his hand on her shoulder.
Are you okay?
His voice softened, and there was concern in it. Aya looked at him, her gaze full of feelings that she couldn't put into words. Emotions were raging inside her, and she didn't know how to deal with them.
Yes, thank you. If it wasn't for you, I don't know what would have happened.
Her voice trembled, but she tried to hold on. Lucas noticed that something was wrong with her, but he didn't press her. He hugged her, trying to calm her down, and Aya felt her heart stop for a moment. There was more to this embrace than just brotherly concern. She snuggled closer to him, and her breathing quickened. Her whole being was responding to his presence, and thoughts were spinning in her head that she was afraid of herself.
You know that I'm always there, right? No matter what happens.
He looked into her eyes, and there was something in his gaze that made her feel safe. Aya nodded, not knowing what to say. Her head was filled with thoughts that she couldn't control.
Why am I reacting like this?
She asked herself. After all, it's just her brother. He always took care of her. But now his every look, every touch seemed different to her. For the first time in her life, she looked at Lucas as a man and not as a brother. This realization hit her like a bolt of lightning. She felt excitement and fear at the same time. It was as if the whole world had turned upside down in an instant, and she didn't know how to deal with this storm of emotions that swept over her. When they finally went home, Aya tried to bring herself back to her usual thoughts, but her heart already knew the truth. These feelings were not simple brotherly emotions, and she could no longer hide it from herself. Aya realized that she was attracted to Lucas in a different way than before, and this frightening and new feeling was not going to just disappear. She spent the whole night awake, trying to figure out what was going on with her. Her heart was racing between fear and excitement. She was afraid to admit that her feelings for her brother had become something else, that it was wrong and abnormal. But it was already impossible to ignore it. She understood that this incident with a stranger was just a catalyst for something that had been brewing in her heart for a long time. Aya understood that she had a difficult path ahead of her, full of doubts and internal struggle. But despite her fear, she felt that she could no longer hide her feelings from herself. Everything had changed, and her relationship with Lucas would never be the same. After the incident with a stranger that happened on the street, Aya realized that her feelings for Lucas go beyond a simple sibling relationship. This realization hit her with such force that she felt as if her whole world had turned upside down. It was something she had never expected, something that caused her both fear and shame. Aya tried to drown out these feelings, to convince herself that this was just a temporary insanity, a game of her imagination. She tried to convince herself that her affection for Lucas was simply the result of their close relationship since childhood, that her heart had simply confused caring and affection with something deeper. However, the more she tried to logically explain what was happening to herself, the more confused she became. She began to notice how her thoughts were increasingly returning to Lucas. Every time he was around, her heart started beating faster. His every gesture, every word, felt different to her than before. What had seemed to her like an ordinary display of brotherly concern now seemed to be filled with a special meaning. She became more sensitive to his presence, and it scared her. The internal conflict began to grow, turning into a real storm of emotions. Aya felt trapped in her own feelings, which was squeezing her more and more. She was afraid of what was happening to her and didn't know how to deal with it. Against the background of this struggle, her life began to lose its usual rhythm. She became less attentive at university, and her academic performance declined. Aya tried to avoid Lucas so as not to face these feelings, but the more she tried to stay away from him, the stronger her attraction became. Every meeting with Lucas was a challenge for her. She couldn't afford to look into his eyes the way she used to, because now she was afraid that he would be able to read her thoughts, that he would guess her feelings. Every time they were alone, Aya felt the ground give out from under her feet, as her heart was torn between the desire to be near him and the need to push him away in order not to let these feelings take over her completely. These experiences began to affect her health. She felt tired more and more often, and she suffered from insomnia. Every night she replayed the events of the past few weeks in her head, trying to find an explanation for her feelings and a way to deal with them. But the more she thought, the more she plunged into the chaos of her own emotions. Aya felt a deep sense of guilt. It seemed to her that she was betraying her family and all those moral values that had been instilled in her since childhood. She knew that such feelings for her brother was something unacceptable, that it violated all possible norms, and it haunted her. She was torn between guilt and a strong, inexplicable attraction. Every time she tried to drown out those feelings, they came back with a vengeance. In an attempt to cope with this, Aya started spending more time alone. She became estranged from her friends, stopped attending events and parties that she used to go to with pleasure. She shut herself in her world, where she tried to find answers to the questions that haunted her. Her inner world turned into a battlefield where every emotion, every breath was soaked with pain and doubt. In moments of despair, Aya thought about leaving everything behind and starting a new life away from Lucas. She imagined how she could leave for another city or country, start from scratch, where no one would know her story. But every time she thought about it, she realized that she couldn't just run away from her feelings. They will always be with her wherever she ends up. Sometimes in moments of weakness, Aya began to think that maybe she could just give in to these feelings. She was attracted to Lucas with such force that she wondered, what if? What if she just confessed everything to him? What if he understands her and reciprocates? These thoughts were dangerous and destructive, but they came again and again, despite all her attempts to suppress them. But then reality returned to her mind. She understood that such a confession could destroy everything: her family, her life, herself. These thoughts scared her to the core, and she began to struggle with herself again, trying to convince herself that all this was just a temporary insanity that would pass if she just stayed away from Lucas. However, no matter how she tried to avoid these feelings, they continued to haunt her. Every little thing reminded her of Lucas, her favorite music, the movies they watched together, the places they visited. It was all a reminder that she couldn't see him the way she used to. Aya also began to fear that her feelings might become visible to others. She felt that her gaze, gestures, and manner could all betray her. She began to realize that her inner world was no longer controlled by herself, that her feelings were getting out of control. She was terrified that someone might guess what was going on inside her, that Lucas might find out the truth. She lived with this fear every day, trying her best to hide her true feelings. But this concealment became more and more difficult. Aya understood that her life would never be the same, that she would never be able to return to the state when Lucas was just a brother. Her heart belonged to him, and it became a source of endless pain and torment for her. Eventually, Aya began to realize that her internal conflict would not resolve itself. She had to find a way out, otherwise she risked losing herself in this maelstrom of emotions. Her life turned into an endless struggle with herself, and she began to realize that she had to make a choice that would determine her future. She knew she had to make a decision, either keep hiding her feelings, trying to drown them out and regain her peace, or find a way to deal with them and move on. But whichever path she chose, Aya realized that this choice would be decisive, and that her future, her relationship with Lucas, and her own well-being depended on it. Every day became a challenge for her, and Aya continued to search for an answer to the question that tormented her heart: how to cope with feelings that cannot be recognized and cannot be ignored. Time passed, but instead of subsiding, Aya's feelings for Lucas grew stronger. She began to notice details that had not previously attracted her attention, and these little things seemed to revive new, even deeper emotions in her heart. More and more often, Aya found herself watching Lucas intently. She began to notice the way he looked at her, the way his eyes lingered on her face longer than the usual brotherly interest required. She had seen something warm and caring in his gaze, but now it seemed to her that there was more to it. Previously, she had perceived this as a natural manifestation of his affection for her, but now her thoughts increasingly turned to the question: does he feel the same way about her? These doubts and guesses made her even more immersed in her thoughts. Aya began to remember every moment when Lucas showed her care or attention. These memories took on a new color, as if a dusty glass ball suddenly shone with bright colors, showing her something she hadn't noticed before. She recalled how he helped her with her studies, how he comforted her in difficult moments, how he was always there when she needed support. But now these actions seemed to her not just a brotherly concern. In his every gesture, in his every word, she saw a reflection of her own feelings, and it scared her. Every day Aya became more and more convinced that her feelings for Lucas were not just a figment of her imagination, but something real that lived inside her. She began to wonder if he felt the same way. These thoughts made her heart beat even faster. She tried to find signs in his behavior that her guesses were correct, but each time doubts prevailed. Aya couldn't afford to make a mistake because the cost of making a mistake was too high. Aya also began to notice how Lucas was touching her. Her skin became more sensitive to his touch, and every time he accidentally brushed her arm or shoulder, she was overcome with trembling excitement. These touches used to seem completely ordinary to her, but now they have become something more. They burned her, making her want more. In these fleeting moments, she searched for signs that could confirm her guesses, but each time she remained in doubt. These doubts began to permeate her daily life. Aya began to analyze their every conversation, every look, every smile of Lucas, trying to find the hidden meaning. She began to wonder why he was so attentive to her, why he was always ready to help her, even in small things. Her mind was stubbornly searching for answers that could explain his behavior. Aya couldn't help but notice that her feelings were getting stronger every day. Now her heart reacted to Lucas not just as a brother, but as a man. She began to catch herself imagining what it would be like if they were not brother and sister, but just two people who are attracted to each other. These thoughts scared her, but she couldn't stop them. Her imagination painted pictures of their life together as a couple, and in these dreams she felt happy. But then reality brought her back to the brutal truth that these feelings were unacceptable. The internal struggle became more intense. Aya couldn't stop thinking about Lucas, couldn't get rid of these thoughts and feelings that consumed her. Her condition became noticeable even to others. Friends and acquaintances began to notice her thoughtfulness, detachment, and sometimes even depression. Her privacy became more apparent, and people around her began to worry about her. But Aya couldn't share her feelings with anyone. She was afraid that if someone found out about her feelings, her world would collapse completely. One of the most difficult moments for Aya was meeting Lucas alone. Each such meeting turned into a test for her. She began to notice the way Lucas looked at her when he thought she wasn't seeing it. She saw something in his gaze that aroused hope in her, but also fear. She began to notice how he sometimes fell silent in her presence, as if he was struggling with thoughts that he did not want to express aloud. Aya began to wonder if he could feel the same way she did. Her inner voice told her that it was possible, but every time she was ready to believe it, doubts came flooding back. She understood that such thoughts could be dangerous, that they could take her too far. But the more she tried to suppress these thoughts, the stronger they became. At this time, Aya began to seek solace in things that used to bring her joy. Music, books, movies, all this helped her to distract herself, but not for long. She began to look for a reflection of her experiences in literature and cinema, trying to find answers to her questions. Aya noticed how she was drawn to stories about forbidden love, how she empathized with heroes who found themselves in similar situations. But in real life, her feelings seemed too heavy for her to just accept. One day she realized that her feelings for Lucas had become so strong that she could no longer ignore them. Her thoughts began to focus only on him. Everything else began to seem insignificant. Even her studies, which used to occupy an important place in her life, have faded into the background. Her academic performance continued to fall, and this became noticeable not only for her, but also for the teachers. She became even more isolated from the outside world, increasingly retreating into her thoughts and dreams. There was a process going on inside Aya that she couldn't control. She began to realize that her feelings for Lucas were not just a temporary infatuation, but something deeper that captured her heart and mind completely. Her thoughts began to turn more and more often to how she could confess her feelings to him, what their future together might look like if they were not related by blood. These thoughts scared her, but she couldn't stop them. Her feelings for Lucas became so strong that she began to realize that she could no longer return to her old life, where he was just a brother. She began to notice how her attraction to him manifested itself in various aspects of her life, in the way she chooses clothes, thinking about whether Lucas would like them, in the way she tries to spend more time with him, despite the fear of being exposed, in the way her heart freezes every day, every time he gets close to her. Aya understood that her feelings had become something she couldn't fight anymore. These emotions became a part of her being, and she could no longer imagine her life without them. But along with this realization came the realization that her feelings could not be accepted by society, that they contradicted all the norms and rules that she knew. She began to think about what to do next. Her heart yearned for Lucas, but her mind told her that this path would lead her to destruction. Aya felt that she had to make a difficult choice between her feelings and what was considered right. But no matter what choice she made, she knew that her life would never be the same. Every day, her inner conflict became more acute, and she began to wonder more and more often if she could withstand this tension, or if eventually her feelings would take over, destroying everything she had built all her life. Aya struggled with her feelings for a long time, but the realization of their power did not leave her peace. She understood that she could no longer live in uncertainty, constantly wondering what Lucas really felt, and what she should do. These thoughts haunted her, destroying her inner world. Gradually, she began to realize that the only way to deal with this was to take a step towards the truth, no matter how bitter it turned out to be. It all started with one quiet evening when she and Lucas, as often happened, were alone. Aya felt especially tense that day. The words she wanted to say seemed to stick in her throat, but the idea that she should reveal her feelings became an obsession for her. She could no longer hide her emotions and felt that if she didn't tell Lucas about what was going on in her heart, she might drown in her own feelings. Lucas, unsuspectingly, started talking about the usual topics: university, weekend plans, mutual acquaintances. However, Aya felt that she couldn't keep up this shallow conversation. She hardly heard what he was saying. Her mind was occupied with only one thing: how to start this conversation, how to find the right words. Her heart was pounding so loudly that it seemed Lucas could hear it. She was afraid that she would not be able to gather her strength, that at the last moment she would retreat and leave everything as it is. But everything was already decided inside her. She knew she couldn't wait any longer. Her soul longed for liberation, her feelings demanded an outlet. And so when Lucas stopped for a moment, Aya, summoning all her willpower, exhaled. This moment was like a point of no return. Aya felt her body tense, her breathing became shallow. There was silence in the room, and she noticed how Lucas froze, suddenly realizing that the conversation was going in an unusual direction for them. Aya felt panic rising in her, but at the same time she realized that she could no longer retreat. The words began to form slowly in her mind. She told Lucas about how long ago she began to be haunted by these strange feelings, how she first tried to fight them, convincing herself that this was just a temporary infatuation, that she was just confused. She explained how these feelings began to grow stronger every day, how her heart could no longer perceive Lucas as a brother, how her mind and heart were fighting unsuccessfully every day. Aya talked about how difficult it was for her to admit to herself that she was in love with her own brother. She told how she was tormented by feelings of guilt and shame, how she tried to ignore her emotions, hide them from everyone, even from herself. But now that she was standing in front of him, she couldn't lie anymore, either to herself or to him. Every word she uttered was given to her with great difficulty. Aya felt her voice tremble and her heart constrict with fear of the possible consequences. She understood that this step could destroy everything: their relationship, their family, herself. But she also knew that this was the only way to get rid of the inner pain that had been tormenting her for a long time. She told Lucas about how his care and attention began to be perceived differently by her, how she began to notice that her feelings went beyond brotherly and sisterly ones. She described how she began to realize that she could no longer ignore the fact that she was attracted to him not as a brother, but as a man. Aya shared with him how she tried to drown out these feelings, convincing herself that they were wrong, but each time they returned with renewed vigor, overwhelming her with her head. Lucas listened to her in silence. Aya didn't dare look into his eyes, afraid to see disgust or condemnation in them. Her soul was torn between the desire to be understood and the fear of being rejected. She knew that after this conversation there would be no turning back, that their relationship would never be the same. She told how she was afraid to confess her feelings to him, fearing that he would reject her, that he would not be able to understand or forgive her. Aya understood that her confession could destroy not only their relationship, but her whole life. But she also understood that she could no longer live in this lie, pretending that everything was okay when her heart was bursting with pain. This whole conversation, every word spoken, was unbearably hard for her. Aya felt her heart constrict with every passing second, but at the same time she felt that with every word she uttered, her soul was a little freed from the burden that she had been carrying for too long. It was a painful release, but she knew she had to go through with it. When she finished speaking, the silence in the room became unbearably dull. Time seemed to stand still, and Aya felt like her whole being was on edge at that moment. It felt like a century before Lucas spoke. But no matter what he said, it was a step for her to finally be free of her suffering, no matter what his response would be. Aya understood that this moment would be a turning point in her life. Whatever happened next, she took the first step that would change everything. And now she could only wait, holding her breath, trying to cope with the inner fear and pain. At that moment, she realized that her confession had become an act of liberation for her, no matter how painful it was, and that now she would have to face the consequences of her choice. That first step had been taken, and now her life depended on how Lucas would take her revelation. Aya understood that there was no turning back anymore, and that a new, unexplored path was waiting for her ahead, which she had set foot on by taking this decisive step. Aya froze, waiting for Lucas's reaction. The confession she had just made seemed to hang in the air, filling the space between them with unbearable tension. Her heart was pounding wildly, and her thoughts were spinning around one thing: what would he say? Everything depended on his answer, and this uncertainty was tearing her apart. Time seemed to have stopped, and every moment lasted forever. Aya was afraid to look up at Lucas for fear of seeing rejection or anger in them. Her mind was painting the darkest pictures, and she was preparing for the worst. But at the same time, there was a faint hope in the depths of her soul that her feelings would not go unanswered. She didn't know what she would do if he rejected her, but she knew she had to be prepared for any outcome. Aya noticed that Lucas was silent for a long time. This silence became unbearable for her. She could feel the tension building, the fear starting to flare up inside her that she had made an unforgivable mistake by opening her heart to him. But suddenly she felt something change in the atmosphere. Lucas seemed to gather his thoughts and slowly began to speak. Aya could hardly believe her ears. Lucas admitted that he had felt the same way about her for a long time. Her heart, which had been clenching with fear, now began to beat with renewed vigor, but this time from shock and incredible relief. She heard him talk about how he himself was struggling with his feelings, trying to stifle them, convince himself that it was wrong. But the more he tried, the stronger his attraction to her became. Lucas admitted that he had lived in fear and doubt for a long time. He told how he tried to ignore these feelings, hoping that they would pass, that it was only a temporary clouding of the mind. But every time he saw Aya, his heart started beating faster and his mind refused to obey logic. He described how hard it was for him to pretend that everything was okay when in fact he was tormented by the same contradictions as her. Aya listened to his confession, and it seemed to her that her heart was ready to burst out of her chest. She couldn't believe that her innermost and most dangerous feelings were separated. This moment was a revelation for her that she could not even imagine. It turned out that all these months and years they both suffered alone, hiding from each other the truth that could have connected them even earlier. Lucas also admitted that, like Aya, he felt guilty and ashamed. He knew that their feelings violated all possible taboos, that they were going against what was considered right and moral. But every day he realized that he couldn't deny that he was attracted to Aya. He described how he tried to fight it, how he hoped that time would fix everything, but instead his feelings only intensified. He told how he often found himself thinking of her not as a sister, but as a woman who occupied his thoughts day and night. He couldn't stop thinking about her, her voice, her smile, her look. These thoughts became obsessive for him, and every time he saw her, it became more and more difficult for him to hide his real feelings. He confessed that all this time he lived in fear that his secret would be revealed, that she would guess what was going on in his soul. When Lucas said these words, Aya felt a wave of euphoria sweep over her soul. She was no longer alone in her worries. It turned out that all these painful thoughts, fears and doubts were common to both of them. This moment was a revelation for both of them, but at the same time it was the beginning of something new and incredibly difficult. The euphoria of mutual recognition flooded them both, but with it came the realization of the complexity of their situation. Aya felt how joy was being replaced by the realization that their feelings would not be able to fit into their usual life, just like that. Their confession to each other, although it was a relief, did not solve the problems that now have to be overcome. They both knew that it wasn't just a crush that could pass with time. Their feelings were real, deep, but that's why they posed a huge threat to their lives, to their family, to everything they knew. Aya realized that difficult decisions and, perhaps, inevitable sacrifices were ahead of them. Awareness of the taboo nature of their situation gradually replaced the euphoria. Lucas and Aya understood that their feelings were contrary to moral norms, that society would not be able to accept them as they are. This fact was undeniable, and they both knew it. Aya felt her joy being replaced by fear of what would happen next. They understood that their confession to each other did not solve the problem, but only opened the door to even more difficult issues. How can they live with these feelings? Will they be able to hide them from everyone else? What happens if their secret is revealed? These questions began to arise in their minds, overshadowing the euphoria of mutual recognition. Aya understood that her life had now changed forever. They were both at a crossroads, and every step they took from now on would determine their future. The realization that they loved each other turned out to be both a blessing and a curse. Aya felt their confession liberating them on the one hand, but driving them into an even deeper trap on the other. At that moment, they both found themselves in a state of shock and euphoria at the same time. It was like suddenly waking up after a long nightmare, but instead of feeling relieved, they realized that now they had to struggle with the reality that surrounds them. Their feelings, although mutual, could not just fit into their former lives. Aya and Lucas understood that now a path full of difficulties and uncertainty awaits them. They were faced with a choice: try to live with these feelings in secret or fight for their happiness, despite all the obstacles. Whichever path they choose, it will change their lives forever. The realization of the complexity and taboo nature of their situation led them to a new stage in their relationship. Now they were connected not only by family ties, but also by a common secret that could both destroy them and connect them even more tightly. Aya understood that now they would be forced to make choices that they had never had to make before. and that their future would be a test of the strength of their love and will. So they stood there, overcome by mixed feelings, joy that their feelings were mutual, and fear of what the future would bring them. Ahead of them was a long and difficult road, on which there were no guarantees. But at that moment, they knew one thing: no matter what happened, they would no longer be alone in their feelings. After Aya and Lucas confessed their feelings to each other, their lives turned upside down. Ahead of them was a path full of difficulties, which began with the first steps of their new relationship. These difficulties were multi-layered and affected all aspects of their lives, from personal to social. The biggest problem they faced was the need to hide their relationship from others. In a society where any non-standard relationship can cause condemnation and misunderstanding, Aya and Lucas found themselves in a difficult situation. Secrecy had become a part of their daily lives, and they both felt constant pressure to relax. Their every action, every word now required careful monitoring to avoid suspicion. Aya and Lucas tried to maintain their usual behavior so as not to raise unnecessary questions. They started meeting in secluded places where no one could see them. These secret dates became like brief oases in the desert for them, where they could afford to be themselves, but each time these moments became more stressful. Every time someone happened to see them, the fear of exposure engulfed them like dark clouds about to burst into a storm. In addition, the very nature of their relationship has given rise to many internal conflicts. Aya and Lucas discovered that despite their strong feelings for each other, they still faced deep moral and ethical dilemmas. They began to realize that their feelings violated generally accepted norms and ideas about what is right and acceptable. These internal conflicts were especially difficult, as they went against what they had been taught since childhood, and this created additional pressure on their emotional state. Every time they discussed their relationship, they were faced with questions that they could not give definite answers to. On the one hand, their feelings were sincere and deeply personal, but on the other hand, public opinion and their own moral principles put them in a difficult position. Aya and Lucas couldn't help but think about how their relationship could affect their future and their relationships with loved ones. They also faced difficulties in their personal lives. Aya and Lucas noticed that their relationship began to affect their interactions with others. Friends and relatives, who used to be an important part of their lives, became less important, as they now felt constant fear of possible exposure. Aya and Lucas began to isolate themselves from their usual social circles, trying to avoid any situation that could jeopardize their secret. This isolation led to a feeling of loneliness, as they could no longer share their experiences with other people, and this only aggravated their inner suffering. In addition, they faced difficulties in their emotional state. For a long time, hiding their feelings, they got used to the inner tension that has become a part of their lives. Even when they could afford to be open with each other, these moments of happiness were marred by constant fear and tension. Their life turned into a continuous struggle between the desire to be together and the need to hide their relationship. One of the most difficult aspects of their situation was accepting their relationship with themselves. Lucas and Aya tried to find inner peace, realizing that their feelings for each other violated generally accepted norms. They struggled with feelings of guilt and shame, which, although partly caused by fear of society, had roots in their own beliefs and moral attitudes. Every day they asked themselves the questions: is what they are doing right? Aren't they trespassing on boundaries that should never be crossed? These internal questions became more and more insistent, and it became more and more difficult to find solace and peace every day. Every time they were together, their happiness was marred by the constant fear that someone might find out about their secret. This fear permeated all their actions and thoughts, forcing them to live in constant tension. Aya and Lucas also began to realize that their feelings for each other had become a source of constant internal tension. From time to time, they found that their relationship led to arguments and disagreements that had not taken place before. These conflicts were the result of the stress they faced trying to keep a secret and hide their real feelings. They found that this secrecy and the need for constant control over their actions created additional difficulties in their relationship, and they began to doubt whether they would be able to overcome all these difficulties. At the same time, they understood that despite all the difficulties they faced, their feelings for each other remained unchanged. These feelings were stronger than all the fears and doubts that haunted them. However, they knew that in order to maintain their relationship, they would need to cope with these difficulties and look for ways to avoid the destruction of all that they had built. Aya and Lucas stood at a crossroads where every step they took mattered. They realized that there were many challenges ahead of them, and that every choice they made could change their future. They will have to face the reality of their relationship and find a way to cope with the difficulties that await them. And despite all the trials, they knew that the only thing they could do was move forward, striving to preserve their love and look for ways to cope with the challenges that life poses to them. After Aya and Lucas faced the first difficulties of their relationship, they realized that their future had become uncertain and burdened with many difficulties. As time went on, the daily struggle to keep secrets and overcome moral and socially acceptable norms became more and more exhausting. They had to make a decision that would determine how their lives would develop and what would become of their relationship. They spent a lot of time thinking about what to do next. Each of them faced internal conflicts and experiences. Aya and Lucas spent many nights discussing their feelings, their mutual impact on their lives and on the future. They realized that their relationship, despite its strength and sincerity, faced huge obstacles. These obstacles are not only social and moral, but also internal, as they both began to have doubts and fear of what might happen next. Every time they discussed their future, they came to the conclusion that further actions could have serious consequences. Thinking that their relationship could destroy their families, affect their friends, and change their lives was unbearably hard. Aya and Lucas knew that their love was more than just an emotional connection, but they also understood that continuing this relationship could lead to social condemnation and potential conflicts with loved ones. They began to consider the two main paths that opened up before them. The first way is to continue the relationship, despite all the difficulties and consequences. To do this, they had to be prepared to live in constant fear of exposure, face moral condemnation, and deal with possible consequences. This path was full of uncertainty and risk, but it also offered a chance that they could keep their connection and create something real together. The second way is to break up for the sake of peace and family preservation. This decision would mean renouncing their feelings, recognizing that their love, although real, cannot be a part of their lives in its usual form. They understood that this path would bring its own difficulties, but at the same time it could provide stability and maintain relationships with loved ones who were important to them. This path would also mean that they would be able to avoid potential conflicts and destruction that could arise from their relationship. Aya and Lucas spent many hours thinking, weighing the pros and cons of each option. They understood that whatever decision they made would change their lives forever. Each of their decisions had huge emotional and social consequences, and this realization only made their choice more difficult. They also realized that none of the solutions would be perfect. Continuing the relationship could lead to constant stress and the need to hide, which could affect their mental health and daily lives. Parting would mean losing something valuable and real that they had found in each other, but it could also provide an opportunity for recovery and a new life free from constant fear and pressure. Eventually, Aya and Lucas came to a decision that reflected their internal struggles. They decided to take a break to think about their future and allow themselves some time to sort out their feelings and determine what they really want from life. This period of time allowed them to look at the situation from the outside and try to find inner peace and understanding of what is really important to them. In this intermediate state, they left open the question of how their future would develop. This decision was not final, but rather temporary, creating a space for reflection and introspection. They understood that their feelings for each other remained strong, but they also realized that they had to be prepared for any outcome, whether it was maintaining a relationship or breaking up. The ending of the story turned out to be open. Aya and Lucas knew that their future was uncertain and that their choices would have far-reaching consequences. This open ending left room for reflection and hope that perhaps in the future they would be able to find a solution that would match their true desires and values. Thus, their story ended on a note of uncertainty, emphasizing the complexity of their situation and the authenticity of their feelings. They remained in search of an answer to the question of how to live on, and every step forward was a step into the unknown. Their path remained open, and only time could show how they would cope with the challenges that lay ahead every day. The anxiety that had settled inside for a long time was only growing. No matter how hard she tried to distract herself with her studies, work, and meetings with friends, thoughts of Lucas would not let her go. But it wasn't just her thoughts that tormented her. Every memory of him caused a whole storm of emotions that she could no longer cope with. Aya knew that her affection for Lucas had long gone beyond brotherly love. These were no longer simple memories of childhood games or school days spent together. She felt something much deeper for him, something that tore her apart. Aya understood that this was wrong, that her feelings for her own brother violated all the norms and moral principles that had been instilled in her since childhood. But they didn't disappear, no matter how hard she tried to convince herself that it was just temporary insanity. The months since she realized her feelings had been a living hell. Aya felt her life begin to lose its meaning. She couldn't concentrate on her studies or her work. Her academic performance at the university declined sharply, and this did not go unnoticed by the teachers. She started avoiding friends, stopped attending social events, although she used to be very active. Everything that used to bring joy has become meaningless. All her thoughts, all her strength, were focused on somehow coping with what was happening inside her. But the scariest thing for Aya was that her feelings for Lucas were getting stronger, not weaker. She felt that every day her heart was drawn more and more to him, and this craving, this inner fire became unbearable. Every time she saw him, she felt the ground give out from under her feet. His every touch, every smile, every word caused such a storm of emotions in her that she could barely restrain herself from giving herself away. Aya was afraid that if this continued, she would simply not be able to stand it. She and Lucas had always been close, and he was not only her brother, but also her best friend. She could tell him everything, share her innermost thoughts, and he always understood her. But now this intimacy was becoming unbearable. She couldn't be around him anymore, couldn't maintain the same relationship as before. Aya knew that the only way out was to cut off all contact with Lucas, to leave his life, no matter how painful it was for her. It was the only thing she could do to keep at least some part of herself. The decision was painful. Aya couldn't imagine her life without Lucas, but at the same time she understood that if nothing was changed, it would lead to even more destruction. Her feelings for him were becoming too dangerous, too intense, and she could no longer control them. Aya was sure that if she continued to communicate with Lucas, her life would turn into endless torture. She couldn't look him in the eye anymore, couldn't communicate with him the way she used to, without her heart pounding wildly. Aya thought for a long time about how to tell Lucas that she needed to leave. She couldn't just disappear without an explanation, but at the same time it was hard for her to find words. How could she explain to him what was going on in her heart when she didn't fully understand it herself? How could she tell him that her love for him had gone beyond brotherly affection without destroying everything? She didn't want him to know how she felt. It would be too painful for both him and her. But it was also impossible to leave in silence. Finally, Aya made a decision. She packed up the things she planned to take with her and arranged for temporary accommodation in another city. She decided to go as far away as possible to put a distance between them that could help her cope with her feelings. It wasn't easy, but she knew there was no other way out. The day before she left, Aya was sitting in a cafe waiting for Lucas. This was their usual meeting place, and she knew that this would be the last time they would see each other. Her hands were shaking and her heart was beating so hard that she could barely breathe. She had thought out in advance what she would say to him, but the closer the moment of the meeting became, the more doubts appeared in her mind. Maybe this is a mistake? Maybe it's worth trying to cope with feelings and not break off the relationship. But these thoughts were immediately replaced by horror at what could happen if she stayed. When Lucas entered the cafe, Aya felt her heart stop. He looked like he always did, confident, smiling, with that same warmth in his eyes that always made her feel safe. But now that warmth was only tearing her apart.
Hi. You're so thoughtful today. Is everything okay?
His voice was so familiar, that Aya wanted to immediately put all her plans out of her head, forget about the decision and just be with him. But she knew she couldn't do it.
Lucas, we need to talk.
These words came to her with great difficulty. She stared at him, trying not to show her excitement, but she felt tears begin to come to her eyes. She was on edge. She wanted to throw her arms around his neck and tell him how much she loved him, but that would be a disaster. Lucas frowned, concern flickering in his eyes. He felt that something was wrong, and this only increased her torment.
What happened? You've been acting weird lately. I'm worried about you.
These words pierced Aya. He was always there for her, always supporting her, and the thought of her leaving him, disappearing from his life forever, was unbearable. But at the same time, she knew that this was the only way to deal with what was happening. Aya sighed, trying to gather all her strength. She couldn't afford to burst into tears right here in this cafe. She had to be strong, if only to end this conversation.
I'm leaving. To another city. I need time for myself. I need to figure out my life. I can't go on as it was.
Lucas looked at her in amazement. He clearly hadn't expected such words. Aya saw his face change, replaced by concern and complete incomprehension.
Are you leaving? But why? We've always dealt with everything together. What has changed?
These questions hurt Aya. He didn't understand what was going on, and she couldn't blame him for that. Her heart was bursting with pain, but she knew she couldn't tell him the truth. It would be too destructive for both of them. She has to leave without explanation. Just disappear, no matter how painful it is.
Lucas, I just can't. I need to sort myself out. That's all I can say.
She tried to speak firmly, but her voice trembled treacherously. A storm of emotions was raging inside her, but she couldn't afford to lose her temper. Aya saw Lucas trying to figure out what was going on, but he clearly couldn't believe that his sister would just leave without an explanation.
But you're coming back, aren't you?
His voice sounded like he was still hoping that this was just a temporary solution. But Aya knew that if she left, she wouldn't come back. She needed to break this bond forever in order to keep at least some part of herself. Her feelings for Lucas were destroying her, and if she didn't leave, they would destroy her completely.
I do not know, Lucas. Just please accept it. I need time.
She couldn't say more. There was a lump in her throat, and she was afraid that if she said another word, she would just burst into tears right there in front of him. This was the last conversation, and she couldn't afford to be weak. Aya stood up, avoiding his gaze, and without saying another word, left the cafe. Outside, she stopped, feeling the world crumble around her. She had just broken the bond that was the most important thing in her life. Her heart was broken, but she knew it was the only way. She needed to leave to save herself. It's been a few weeks since Aya left. For Lucas, this time was a real nightmare. He couldn't understand what had happened and why his younger sister had suddenly made such a strange decision. Aya was his best friend, the person with whom he could share everything in the world. Their bond had always seemed unbreakable, and now that it was suddenly broken, Lucas couldn't find a place for himself. He tried to contact Aya, but her phone was turned off and messages went unanswered. This silence was tearing him apart. Lucas has always been a man of action. He was used to solving problems and never gave up before difficulties. But this situation was different. Aya simply disappeared from his life without giving any explanation. He felt powerless, because no amount of his efforts could bring her back. All their joint plans, habits, rituals suddenly lost their meaning. He was used to spending time with his sister, and her absence created a void in his life that nothing could fill. Every morning, Lucas woke up thinking that Aya was no longer around. He tried to get back to his usual life work, friends, parties, it all happened, but everything seemed colorless and unreal. He couldn't stop thinking about her, about what would make her leave. It seemed to him that he had missed something, that he had been inattentive to what was happening inside her. They have always been close, sharing their innermost thoughts and experiences with each other. But now Lucas realized that he didn't know something important that Aya was hiding from him. He couldn't just sit and wait. Every new attempt to contact her ended in failure. Lucas began to wonder if he had done something that had pushed her to take such a step. Had he offended her in some way? But what could it be? He replayed the last months of their communication in his head, trying to find a clue. Everything seemed the same as always. He couldn't figure out what the reason was. Lucas started looking for her through friends and acquaintances, but no one knew where she was now. Aya has always been independent, and even her closest friends did not know where she decided to settle. This silence irritated Lucas on all sides. He felt that his life had turned upside down, and now he had lost the core that had always been a pillar of support. It took a few more days before Lucas decided that he couldn't just sit back anymore. He knew that he had to find Aya, no matter how difficult the path was. He felt that there were too many unexplained things between them. It wasn't just an impulse caused by disappointment. Lucas sensed that there was something much deeper in their relationship that they were both afraid to admit. And now that Aya is gone, that understanding has only become sharper. His search began with the simplest steps. Lucas began writing to her university professors, claiming that he was worried that he couldn't find her. But even here, he was disappointed Aya suspended her studies without telling anyone where she was. Her name disappeared from all the lists, as if she had erased her existence from the usual circle of people. This fact only increased Lucas' anxiety. She didn't just leave, but decided to disappear completely. What could have made her do that? What thoughts and emotions made her take such a step? The more Lucas thought about it, the more convinced he became that Aya was hiding something she couldn't tell him. He started going through all the possible places where she could be. Aya loved to travel, and Lucas remembered how she dreamed of some cities. She always said that she would like to visit Chicago, a city that seemed to her not as cold and oppressive as megacities like New York or Los Angeles. Perhaps she decided to start a new life there. It was just a guess, but Lucas had no choice but to follow his intuition. Lucas quit his job for a week, took a short vacation and bought a ticket to Chicago. He didn't know if he would find her there, but he couldn't just stay at home anymore. The feeling of emptiness and uncertainty was destroying him from the inside. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was losing control of the situation. Every new day without Aya made his life grey and barren. When he arrived in Chicago, the city seemed strange and gloomy to him. The cold autumn wind pierced through to the bones, and the grey skyscrapers intensified the feeling of loneliness. Lucas strolled through the streets, trying to imagine where Aya could live. He started going into cafes where they could have crossed paths if she had really been here, but the search was not successful. Chicago was too big a city to just happen to meet someone. But Lucas didn't give up. He began checking local libraries, universities, even student dormitories. He showed her a photo, hoping that someone would recognize her and tell him where she was. Several days of unsuccessful searches passed, but Lucas did not despair. He felt he had to be persistent. One evening, when he was beginning to lose hope, Lucas went into a small cozy cafe on the outskirts of the city. This place reminded him of their favorite cafe at home, where they often spent time talking about everything in the world. He didn't expect anything special. He just decided to have a cup of coffee, when suddenly his gaze fell on a familiar silhouette in the far corner of the hall. It was her Aya.
Aya?
Her name came out of his mouth before he had time to think. Aya raised her head and their eyes met. Time seemed to slow down at that moment. She looked different, more tired than before, but it was still her, the sister he had been looking for all these weeks. Her face reflected a mixture of shock and concern. She hadn't expected to see him here.
Lucas.
Her voice was low, almost a whisper. She didn't move, just sat at her desk, as if she was afraid that any movement would destroy the fragile reality of this moment. Lucas took a step towards her, but stopped when he saw that she was not ready to talk.
I've been looking for you. Why did you leave? Why didn't you say anything?
Aya looked away, unable to meet his gaze. She knew this moment was inevitable, but she still wasn't ready for it. Feelings she couldn't control were fighting inside her. She had run away, hoping to find a way to deal with her emotions, but now Lucas was here, and her inner world began to crumble again.
I needed time. I couldn't go on like I used to.
Those words were empty and meaningless to Lucas. He couldn't figure out what was behind this time she needed. In his eyes, it seemed like an excuse. He knew his sister too well to believe in such simple explanations.
Time. From what? We've always been there for you, Aya. Why do you think you can just leave it all like that?
His voice was filled with anger and pain. He couldn't understand why she had made such a decision without him, why she hadn't trusted him with her feelings. There had always been a place for trust in their relationship, and now that trust seemed to have been destroyed. Aya didn't know how to explain to him what she couldn't quite understand herself.
I can't explain it, Lucas. Simply, please understand. I had to leave. It was for my own good.
She could feel the tears starting to come to her eyes, but she couldn't afford to cry. She'd been trying to keep her emotions under control all this time. But now that Lucas was standing in front of her, everything she'd tried to forget was coming back to the surface. Her inner world was in chaos, and she knew she couldn't explain to him everything that was going on inside her. Lucas sighed at her words. He didn't understand what exactly was bothering her, but he could see that she was suffering. It couldn't be an easy decision for her, nor was it easy for him. But he was determined not to let it end like this. He couldn't let her disappear from his life.
I'm not giving up, Aya. You can hide as much as you want, but I won't let you just walk away. We have to figure this out together, as always.
Aya looked at him, feeling her heart constrict with pain and love at the same time. She understood that Lucas would never leave it just like that, but she knew that she would not be able to return to what was before. Her feelings for him were too strong, too dangerous. But his words awakened hope in her that maybe they could figure it out after all, if not now, then someday. Aya nodded, not knowing what to say. This moment was too hard for her, but she couldn't run away anymore. Lucas wasn't going to give up, and that meant she would have to find a way to deal with what was going on in her heart. After meeting Lucas in Chicago, Aya felt that her life was out of control again. That encounter was like a reminder of what she was trying to escape from, but it finally convinced her that she couldn't just ignore her feelings. Her departure, her decision to disappear, her desire to start a new life, all this turned out to be useless, because just the presence of Lucas reawakened emotions inside her that she tried to suppress. But Aya knew she couldn't afford to fall into the same emotions again. Back in her new life, Aya did her best to regain control of her existence. She got a job, which she found shortly after moving to Chicago. Work became her salvation. It allowed her to keep her thoughts under control and occupy every minute with something useful. Her office was in the center of the city, surrounded by skyscrapers and bustle, and this business environment helped her to take her mind off everything personal. She tried to avoid any intimacy with her colleagues, kept her distance and focused solely on her duties. Every day, Aya came to the office early in the morning and left late at night. Work became her refuge, a place where she could not think about her feelings for Lucas, about her torment and inner struggle. But as soon as she returned home, her thoughts returned to her brother. She replayed that meeting in her head, his eyes full of concern, his attempts to understand her. Aya understood that his indifference only increased her own pain, because she knew that they would never be able to be together in the way her heart desired. Despite her attempts to distract herself, loneliness and internal conflict weighed on her with renewed vigor. Aya began to realize that her escape had not solved the problem, it had only postponed it. She left her life behind, but her feelings did not disappear. She was sure that she would never be able to truly forget Lucas, but she could not continue to live in this state either. At some point it became clear to her that she needed to try something new, maybe even build a relationship with someone else. Aya pushed this thought away for a long time, because she believed that no new relationship could overshadow her feelings for Lucas. But eventually she realized that if she didn't try to start life over with someone else, she risked being trapped in her emotions forever. Her feelings for Lucas seemed an inevitable part of her being, but she knew that if she continued to live with it inside, she would completely lose herself. The appearance of a new person in her life was unexpected. There was a man named Michael in the office where she worked, who had noticed her from the first days of her work. He was several years older than her, confident, with a slight smile and kind eyes. Michael was one of those people who could always find the right words to cheer up, always came to the rescue on time, and was a reliable support for everyone in the team. His charm and charisma could not go unnoticed, and Aya, although she tried to keep him at a distance, soon felt that she liked him. Michael took his time courting. He watched Aya from afar, seeing in her something more than just a new colleague. She was withdrawn and secretive, but there was something about her that attracted him: inner strength, independence, and at the same time a visible vulnerability that she carefully hid. Michael understood that Aya was going through something deep, and it intrigued him. Unlike other women, who easily agreed to compliments and flirting, Aya always remained cold and distant. But her mystique only fueled his interest. Aya resisted his attention for a long time. She knew that any infatuation with Michael would only be superficial, because her heart still belonged to Lucas. But Michael was persistent, and at some point she realized that this could be her chance to try to live a different life. He didn't look like Lucas, and that seemed right to her. She hoped that if she was with him, she would be able to forget about her previous feelings, at least for a while. Their first meetings were cautious. Aya didn't want to show that she was interested in Michael, but she couldn't completely ignore his attention either. He invited her to lunch, arranged small surprises in the office, and tried to maintain a light and relaxed atmosphere. It was a strange experience for Aya. She was not used to such care and attention from a man who was not Lucas. Michael was kind and considerate, but Aya found herself comparing him to her brother all the time. She tried to suppress these comparisons, convincing herself that it was part of her healing process. She needed to stop thinking about Lucas, and Michael seemed like an opportunity to do that. However, inside she couldn't get rid of the feeling that these weren't real feelings. Every time Michael touched her hand or complimented her, her heart didn't respond the way it did when Lucas did. She felt like she was on stage, playing a role, but not feeling a real inner response. Despite this, Aya continued to date Michael. She felt she had to give herself a chance at something new, even if it didn't seem right to her. Their relationship began to develop. Michael turned out to be patient and did not put pressure on her. Although he was well aware that Aya was hiding something, he saw that her emotions were restrained, that she was not ready for serious steps, and respected her boundaries. At one point he even tried to find out from her what exactly was bothering her, but Aya skillfully avoided such conversations. Michael was a good man, and Aya knew it. He was caring, attentive, and seemed to sincerely want them to succeed. But every day she felt more and more acutely that her feelings for him were superficial. Every time they spent time together, she tried to convince herself that it was just a matter of time, that real affection would come later, but her heart still belonged to Lucas. The more she tried to establish herself in the idea that Michael could be her future, the stronger her inner tension became. Each new meeting with him turned into a kind of test. She felt that Michael deserved something more than the little emotion she could give him, but she couldn't bring herself to be truly sincere with him. Every day she felt more and more that she was deceiving not only Michael, but also herself. She kept hoping that one day she would be able to feel for him the same way she felt for Lucas, but those hopes were in vain. The fire of that forbidden love that she had tried so hard to stifle was still burning inside her. A few months later, Aya realized that her attempt to build a new relationship had failed. She could no longer continue this deception. She could not afford to be with a man for whom she had no true affection. It wasn't fair to Michael, who was trying to make her happy, but no matter what he did, her heart remained closed. One evening, when they were having dinner together, Aya looked at Michael and realized that she could no longer continue this relationship. She saw the expectation in his eyes, the hope that she would finally open up to him, but she couldn't do it. She couldn't give him what he wanted. At that moment, Aya realized that she needed to finish this not only for his sake, but also for her own. She needed to get rid of the illusions that a new relationship would help her forget Lucas. Aya decided to end her relationship with Michael. It was a difficult decision, because she knew she would hurt him. He didn't deserve to end up like this. He was a good man, and she knew he deserved someone who could truly love him. But she couldn't deceive him or herself anymore. When Aya told him about her decision, Michael accepted. It's with amazing calmness. He had long felt that she was not really with him. Although he was in pain, he did not reproach her. He realized that Aya was struggling with something inside herself, and that her feelings for him had never been strong enough to build a future. Michael was disappointed, but at the same time admitted that their relationship was doomed from the very beginning. The breakup with Michael left Aya alone with herself. She was back at the same point where she had started, all the same painful thoughts about Lucas, all the same feelings that she could not overcome. But now she realized that no new relationship would help her forget about what was going on inside her. Michael was just an attempt to get away from his feelings, and that attempt failed. Aya realized that she would have to deal with her love for Lucas somehow, because there was no point running away from her anymore. She could try again and again, but each time she ended up with the same thing: her heart remained devoted to someone it could not truly love. A year has passed since Aya decided to sever all ties with Lucas and start her life with a clean slate. This year was full of inner feelings, suffering, and attempts to forget the past, which, as it turned out, were in vain. Time seemed to move slowly, and attempts to build a new life did not bring the results she had hoped for. Aya moved to another city, started a new relationship with Michael, but all this only temporarily distracted her from the fact that the breakup with Lucas left a void in her soul that no one else could fill. This year has been full of events that Aya might not want to remember. She immersed herself in her work, trying as little as possible to think about what she had left behind. Her thoughts about Lucas gradually faded into the background, but they never completely disappeared. Every morning, every evening, every moment of silence was filled with the ghostly image of the brother she loved, but could not afford to love. She always knew that at some point she would have to face reality again, but she hoped that it would happen as late as possible. Her new life in Chicago was full of routine, which helped her cope with constant pain. Aya got a job at a law firm, where she got the opportunity to move up the career ladder. Her skills and desire for success were quickly noticed, and this became another salvation for her from thoughts of the past. The working days were busy, demanding full concentration, and this allowed her to at least temporarily not think about Lucas. But as evening fell, when she was alone in her small apartment, her inner demons returned. Aya often wondered what was going on in Lucas's life. She tried to imagine how he was living without her, whether he had continued his life, whether he had found someone who could replace her place in his heart. She tried not to check his social media, not to contact mutual friends, so as not to find out how he was doing. Any information about him could only increase her suffering, because she knew that if she returned her thoughts to the past, she would have to fight again with feelings that had not disappeared anywhere. Every time she came across the memories of Lucas, her heart was filled with conflicting emotions. On the one hand, she was proud that she was able to leave, that she had made the right choice, allowing both herself and him to move on. On the other hand, she still yearned for the closeness they shared. The pain of losing this relationship was too deep to just disappear. Even after a year, Aya felt that her soul continued to live in the past, although her body was in the present. On top of everything else, her attempt to start a relationship with Michael turned out to be unsuccessful. At first, Aya believed that she could love him, but every day with him only intensified her inner struggle. Michael was a good man, attentive and caring, but her heart never beat the way it did when Lucas was around. After several months of unsuccessfully trying to be happy with another man, Aya broke off this relationship. She couldn't pretend that everything was okay anymore when a hurricane of contradictions was raging inside her. Her life in Chicago became a vicious circle. Work, home, rare meetings with friends, all this did not bring real relief. Aya felt that despite all her attempts to get away from the past, she was still clinging to it. But despite this, she continued to persistently move forward, hoping that time would heal her wounds sooner or later. However, everything changed when an invitation to a family event arrived. It was an annual meeting of a large family on the occasion of their parents' wedding anniversary. Every year the whole family gathered together to celebrate this event, and it would be unacceptable to miss it. Aya understood that she could not refuse, although she knew that Lucas would be at this celebration. She spent the whole way home to her hometown in anxious thoughts. Her heart was torn between the desire to see her brother and the fear that this meeting would revive those feelings that she had been trying to suppress for so long. She knew that she would not be able to hide her emotions if they met face to face, but to refuse the invitation would be too suspicious. The family didn't know what she was hiding, and if she hadn't come, it would have raised a lot of questions that she didn't have answers to. When Aya finally arrived home, she felt as if she had returned to the past again. Everything reminded her of the days when she and Lucas were inseparable. In childhood and adolescence, they always spent a lot of time together in this house, and every corner was saturated with memories of it. Her heart sank when she realized that in the next few hours she would have to meet her brother again. The family party was held in a large country house, where Aya spent many happy moments as a child. When she entered the house, everything looked the same as before. Parents, relatives, family, friends, everyone was here. The noise of conversation, laughter, the sounds of celebration, all this should have distracted her, but she knew that Lucas was somewhere among this crowd. Aya tried to avoid his gaze, but she felt his presence. She felt that every step she took was aimed only at not being near him. However, with each passing hour, the tension inside her grew. Her heart beat faster when she felt Lucas was there, even if they weren't talking to each other. She saw him out of the corner of her eye, the same confident and calm he always was. His smile, his laugh, all this awakened old feelings in her, and Aya realized that she had hoped in vain that she would be able to avoid these emotions. At some point, when everyone was busy talking and dancing, Aya felt that she could no longer be in this house. Her breathing quickened, and she went outside to get some fresh air. It was quiet and peaceful outside. The light of the lanterns softly illuminated the courtyard. She leaned on the railing of the terrace, trying to calm her heartbeat. But just as she started to regain control, the door behind her opened and Aya heard footsteps. She knew who it was without even turning around. Lucas walked over to her. He, too, felt the tension that had been hanging in the air since her arrival. This year has been no less difficult for him. Despite all his attempts to forget about what had happened, he couldn't get rid of the thought of his sister. The meeting in Chicago only increased his anxiety, but he couldn't bring himself to try to find her again. He respected her desire to leave, but that didn't mean his feelings were gone. Like Aya, Lucas lived in the shadow of this forbidden love that neither of them could afford. They were standing side by side on the terrace, and at that moment, time seemed to stop. Everything that happened inside the house ceased to matter. They stood in silence, each with their own thoughts and feelings. It was a strange mixture of pain and relief to finally be close to each other again, but to realize that their feelings had not changed, but only become stronger. Aya felt her heart constrict with tension. She wanted to leave, to run away again, but she knew that it would not solve her problems. She couldn't run away from her emotions anymore. Meeting Lucas made her admit that neither time nor distance helped her cope with what she was feeling. This year, spent trying to forget him, turned out to be a waste of time. They were both silent. They didn't need words to understand each other. Aya knew that Lucas felt as conflicted about her presence as he felt about hers. She felt that every moment with him only intensified her inner struggle, but she couldn't leave. Despite all the pain and confusion of their relationship, Aya could no longer deny that Lucas was still the most important person in her life. Lucas didn't know what to say either. During this year he tried to live his life, but nothing could replace his sister. He was sure that he would have done the same as her if he had been in her place. But that didn't make their meeting any less painful. He understood that their bond was too strong to just forget about it. And at that moment, standing on the terrace in silence, they both realized that no amount of time or distance could destroy what bound them. This meeting was a moment of truth for Aya. She realized that all her attempts to escape from her feelings had been in vain. Her love for Lucas did not disappear, but only intensified over time. This year away from him had shown her that she couldn't truly be free as long as she continued to struggle with what she was feeling. And although she did not know what would happen next, one thing became obvious to her. She could no longer live pretending that her feelings did not exist. After that fateful meeting with Lucas at a family holiday, Aya returned to Chicago in even more confusion than before. Her attempts to escape from her feelings completely failed. Despite the year she spent away from her brother, her love for him did not weaken, but on the contrary, became even stronger. The internal struggle that had plagued her from the very beginning continued to tear her apart, and the more she tried to hide it from herself and others, the more her suffering became. After returning to the city, Aya plunged back into work, trying to fill her time and thoughts with anything rather than thinking about Lucas. But even in the midst of her work, her mind kept returning to the moment when they were standing next to each other on the terrace. His gaze, his closeness, all this awakened feelings in her that she tried to stifle, and now it seemed to her that she would never be able to get rid of this pain. Shortly after that meeting with Lucas, her new partner, Michael, began to notice changes in Aya's behavior. Although their relationship was already going through difficult times, after returning from her hometown, she became even more distant, withdrawn and emotionally unavailable. Michael was patient and attentive, but even he couldn't help but notice that something had gone wrong. With each passing week, Aya became more and more immersed in her inner feelings, and their relationship began to crumble before her eyes. Michael was the one who gave Aya a chance to start a new life. He was kind and sincere, tried to be a support for her, despite the fact that she often withdrew into herself. He didn't know what exactly she was fighting, but he sensed that Aya was hiding something important. He saw how her mood was changing, how she was becoming more and more withdrawn, and this caused him more and more questions. Michael tried not to push her, hoping that she would come to him with an explanation, but every day his patience ran out. For Aya, Michael became a kind of salvation, an opportunity to get away from those forbidden feelings that were tearing her apart. She hoped that she could love him, that a relationship with him would help her forget about Lucas, but all her efforts were in vain. Michael was a good man, but her heart remained closed to him. She knew she couldn't give him what he wanted, but she kept hoping that things would change over time. However, after that meeting with Lucas, Aya realized that her feelings for her brother had not disappeared anywhere. Moreover, they have become even stronger. Every time she tried to be with Michael, her heart went back to Lucas over and over again. She tried to fight with herself, to convince herself that Michael was her future, that she could build a normal life with him. But it seemed increasingly impossible to her. Her love for Lucas did not allow her to move on. Michael, although he did not know all the details, began to notice that something was wrong. He noticed how Aya became even more withdrawn and detached after returning from a trip. Their conversations became shallow, and even the moments when they spent time together seemed empty and insignificant to her. Her thoughts were always somewhere else, and Michael could feel it. He tried to have frank conversations with her, but each time she avoided answers, walked away from the topic, not wanting to immerse herself in her inner feelings. Over time, the tension between them began to grow. Aya felt that she could no longer pretend that her relationship with Michael had a future. She didn't want to hurt him, but her feelings for Lucas had become so strong that she couldn't ignore them anymore. At the same time, Michael increasingly noticed her detachment and coldness, and this could not but affect their relationship. One day, when they were together in her apartment, Michael decided to have a frank conversation. He could no longer tolerate the uncertainty and the constant feeling that Aya was hiding something important. There was pain and disappointment in his voice when he asked what was happening to her and why she was constantly moving away. Aya, feeling that she could no longer continue this deception, was unable to give him specific answers. She tried to explain that her inner world was too complicated, that she was confused about her feelings, but she couldn't reveal the truth that her heart belonged to Lucas. This conversation was a turning point in their relationship. Michael, despite his feelings for Aya, realized that she would not be able to give him what he was waiting for. He was sensitive enough to see that she was going through something much deeper than just temporary difficulties. He knew that Aya was not ready to open up to him completely, and this understanding was the last straw for him. After this conversation, their relationship began to rapidly collapse. Aya could no longer maintain the appearance that everything was fine. Her heart was consumed with thoughts of Lucas, and every day with Michael became a torment for her. She felt guilty about him, because she knew he deserved to be with someone who could truly love him. But she couldn't offer him that because her feelings for Lucas were too strong. Michael, too, could no longer live in a state of uncertainty. He saw that their relationship had reached an impasse, and although he still loved Aya, he understood that these feelings were one-sided. He tried to fight for their future, but gradually began to realize that continuing this relationship would only increase his own pain. Aya couldn't offer him what he needed to create a strong alliance, and he understood that. For several weeks, their relationship dragged on in agonizing uncertainty. They continued to meet, spend time together, but every moment was filled with tension and hidden emotions. There was a storm of contradictions inside Aya. She wanted to move forward, but she couldn't let go of her feelings for Lucas. Michael became more and more distant, realizing that his efforts to maintain this relationship were in vain. Finally, the moment came when everything became obvious. Aya realized that she could not continue this relationship, and she had to make a difficult decision. She knew she had to break them off so she wouldn't hurt Michael anymore. It was a difficult decision because she didn't want to hurt him, but at the same time she understood that continuing this relationship would only be a torment for both of them. Aya invited Michael to dinner to discuss everything that had accumulated over the past months. She thought for a long time about how to tell him the truth, but eventually realized that she had to be honest. Michael was an important person in her life, and she didn't want to lie to him anymore. She couldn't tell him that her heart belonged to someone else, but she was able to admit that she couldn't offer him what he deserved. That evening was filled with silence and tension. Aya tried her best to be sincere, but her voice trembled with excitement and guilt. She knew that she was disappointing Michael, that she was breaking his heart, but it was the only right decision. Michael, in turn, listened to her, trying to contain his emotions. He had long ago realized that their relationship had come to an end, but hearing this from Aya was the last blow for him. They didn't see each other again after that dinner. Michael left her life as quietly as he appeared. Their relationship ended, leaving Aya feeling relieved and guilty at the same time. She knew that she had done the right thing by breaking off this relationship, but her heart was heavy with the realization that she was alone again. And even though Michael was a good man, her thoughts and feelings still returned to Lucas. Left alone, Aya realized that she could no longer continue to live, ignoring her feelings. Her love for Lucas has not disappeared, despite all her attempts to start a new life. Now that her relationship with Michael was over, it became clear to her that the future she was trying to build away from her brother was just an illusion. Her heart couldn't betray how she felt about Lucas, and she needed to find a way to deal with it. After breaking up with Michael and completing her failed attempts to start a new life, Aya found herself at a crossroads. Everything she had tried to build this year away from Lucas had collapsed. She tried to escape from her feelings, hide from reality, immerse herself in work, new relationships, and even a new life, but each time her heart returned to her brother. Now that her life was in chaos again, she was faced with the same question she had been running from: what to do with this forbidden love that was not giving her any peace. Aya thought for a long time about what she should do next. Her feelings for Lucas were not only intense but also frightening. She understood that loving her own brother was something that society would not accept, and the realization of this tore her apart all the time. However, after all that she had been through, she realized that she could no longer ignore what was going on in her heart. It wasn't just a stage in her life, it was her essence. Her love for Lucas was a part of her. Time could not erase it. A new relationship did not help to distract, and running away only increased this craving. After the breakup with Michael, and especially after that meeting with Lucas at the family holiday, Aya increasingly thought that she needed to talk to her brother. She couldn't run away from reality anymore. Her love for Lucas was too strong, and now she needed to do something about it. But what? How could she admit such feelings to a man who was so close to her, but whom she was afraid of losing at the same time? Every time Aya started thinking about confessing her feelings to Lucas, she was terrified. She didn't know how he would react. Perhaps he will reject her, finding her confession disgusting and unacceptable. What if he just stopped talking to her? This fear tore her apart, but she could no longer remain in a state of uncertainty. Her heart screamed that she had to do something, that further attempts to suppress her feelings would lead her to self-destruction. Aya decided that she needed to meet Lucas to finally talk to him openly. The internal conflict was bothering her. She knew it was a risk, that talking could ruin everything, but she needed to find out the truth. No matter how painful it was for her, Aya realized that only frankness could free her from this painful burden. She could no longer live in a state of perpetual fear and uncertainty. It had been several weeks since the night she decided to end her relationship with Michael, and during that time Aya had been trying to collect her thoughts. Her inner world was in complete turmoil. On the one hand, she understood that her feelings for Lucas could destroy their relationship, but on the other hand, she could no longer live in a state of perpetual pretense. She had to tell him the truth, even if it would be painful for both her and him. One evening, Aya decided to write to Lucas. She thought about every word for a long time, her hands trembling as she typed the message. In the end, she sent a short message asking to meet, without further explanation, just indicating that they needed to talk. She was afraid that he might not answer, but to her surprise, the answer came quickly. Lucas agreed to meet her at the very cafe where they usually met before. On the day they were supposed to meet, Aya felt like she had a huge burden on her shoulders. She knew that this conversation could change everything. Her fear of the possible consequences was huge, but inside she had the determination to finally admit her feelings. When she entered the cafe, she saw Lucas sitting at their usual table. He looked like he had been waiting for her all his life. His gaze was full of concern and anxiety, but at the same time he seemed to feel that this conversation would be important for both of them. Aya sat down opposite him, feeling her insides tighten with tension. This whole year of fighting with herself had brought her to this moment. Her heart was beating so fast that she could barely breathe. Her fingers were trembling, and she was afraid to look up at her brother, because she knew that his gaze could break her resolve. But she gathered all her willpower into a fist and began to speak. She told him everything, starting from the moment she began to realize that her feelings for him had changed. Aya frankly confessed how long she had been trying to fight this love, how she had run away, hoping that the distance would help her cope with it. She talked about Michael, about how she tried to build a relationship with him to forget about Lucas, but realized that no other man could replace him in her heart. Her voice trembled as she talked about how much she was tormented by this love that she couldn't control. Lucas listened to her attentively, without interrupting. He saw how hard it was for her to say those words, and his own heart ached from the pain she was going through. Her frankness broke the invisible barrier that had existed between them all this year. He felt that they were both suffering because of this forbidden love, and the realization that their feelings were mutual startled him. At the same time, this realization was both a relief and a curse. After a long pause, in which each of them digested what they had heard, Lucas also confessed his feelings to Aya. He told her about how he was painfully trying to cope with the same pain as she was. His heart was torn apart every time he tried to forget her, but he knew it was impossible. Meeting on a family holiday only increased his torment, but he did not dare to take a step forward, for fear of destroying what remained between them. When they both admitted their feelings, the silence that hung in the air was almost palpable. It was the moment of truth when all the masks were ripped off and their hearts were exposed. They both understood that what they felt for each other could not be accepted by society. This love wasn't just a contradiction, it was a taboo that both of them couldn't ignore. But despite all these prohibitions, they could no longer deny their feelings. Aya and Lucas realized that their future was now hanging in the balance. They knew that if they decided to be together, they would have to face enormous difficulties. Their love will never be approved by family, friends, or society. They will have to live in secret, hiding their feelings from anyone who might condemn them. It was a huge risk, but they both understood that they could no longer live pretending that all this did not exist. They sat together in this cafe for a long time, silently, thinking about everything that had happened. Their hearts were full of contradictions. On the one hand, it was love that they could not resist, and on the other, the understanding that this love could destroy their lives. But now that they had confessed to each other, they had no choice. They had to decide how to live their lives, and it was not an easy decision. Aya felt that she was no longer alone in her struggle. This year had been full of pain, but now she knew that her feelings weren't one-sided. It gave her strength, but at the same time she understood that their path would be extremely difficult. There were many obstacles ahead of them, but now they were ready to accept this challenge. Aya and Lucas knew that their love would never be simple, but they decided to give it a chance. They did not know what would happen next. They did not know if they would be able to cope with the difficulties that awaited them. But they were determined to try. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was their only option. Aya and Lucas could no longer live in a state of constant suppression of their feelings. Now they were in this fight together, and whatever lay ahead, they were ready to go through it together. At parting, they exchanged glances full of understanding and love. There was everything in that look: fear of the unknown, relief that they were no longer alone in their suffering, and determination to move on, no matter what. It was a moment that changed their lives forever. Aya and Lucas did not know what path they had to go through, but they knew one thing: now they would walk it together, regardless of what society, family, or even their own inner fears said. Their love was too strong to be ignored. And now they were ready to give her a chance, no matter how hard the choice was. Aya was sitting in her apartment on the edge of the city, where all the walls seemed to be squeezing and the air was heavy and thick. Every corner of this small space was all too familiar to her, reminding her of the days when everything seemed simpler, easier, when there was no unbearable heaviness that haunted her now. Things were packed, the suitcase was at the door, and the phone was silent, as it had been for the last few days. All she had to do was get up, grab her bag and leave. But this simple thought seemed irresistible, as if her whole life depended on one step. And so it was. The decision to leave seemed unquestionable. It had matured in her over the long months, when every minute with Lucas only intensified her inner struggle. They couldn't be just brother and sister anymore, couldn't live like they used to, without the shadow that was getting bigger. Whenever Aya looked into his eyes, she felt her heart yearn for him, but she couldn't admit it. This forbidden love tore her apart, turned every meeting into torture. She tried to run away from it, but the further she ran, the stronger the craving became. Aya realized that the only thing left for her was to leave, to go so far away that their paths would never cross again. Her departure was not spontaneous. She had thought it all out carefully, as if she was preparing for this retirement from life. Work, studies, friends, all of this seemed unimportant compared to what was happening inside her. Aya has reached a dead end, and the only way out is to disappear. She moved to another city, where no one knew her, to start from scratch, as if running away not only from Lucas, but also from herself. Those last days in his hometown flew by in a fog. Meeting Lucas at the cafe left deep scars on her heart. She had never thought that she would see him so confused, as if her departure had destroyed his world too. Aya replayed this moment in her head many times, his look full of misunderstanding and pain, his voice asking for an explanation. But how can you explain something that you can't explain to yourself?
Lucas, we need to talk.
Her voice was trembling, but she was trying to look firm. The words were hard to come by, each letter seemed to beat her from the inside. She saw his face tighten, as worry overshadowed the habitual confidence in his eyes. At that moment, Aya realized how deeply she had dragged herself into this pit. They were too close to just break the connection. But it was necessary. No matter how much it hurt, no matter how much she wanted to stay, Aya knew that leaving was her only chance to save herself. When she finally regained her strength and got up from the chair, her footsteps were heavy. She tried not to look back, so as not to see his expression. It would be too much. One thought was pounding in my head: do it now while you still can. Aya walked out of the cafe, feeling as if her soul had left her body. Only the shell remained, empty but still firm in its decision. The move was difficult not only emotionally but also physically. Aya couldn't afford the luxury of postponing this decision. She quickly found a place to live in a city she didn't know much about and started packing. This process was painful. Everything, every object in the apartment reminded her of Lucas. Their shared memories hung in the air, permeating every corner of the room. It seemed that the suitcases she was filling were getting heavier, not from things but from unspoken words and unrequited feelings.
That's all. I have to go.
The words spoken aloud sounded like a verdict, final and unchangeable. Her gaze stopped at the photo that stood on the shelf, their childhood photo, where they were still carefree and happy. Aya sighed and turned away. All this should have been left in the past, but something in her heart told her that leaving it behind would be harder than she had imagined. The first time in a new city was like the beginning of a new life. Everything was strange, and new streets, buildings, people. No one knew her story, no one looked at her with condemnation or misunderstanding. She could have been anyone, started with a clean slate, but that blank slate was still stained with past experiences. Every evening, when Aya returned to her small rented apartment, silence covered her head. It was a time when the ghosts of the past resurfaced. She tried to keep herself in control, immersing herself in work, study, even sports. All this was just an attempt to fill the void that Lucas had left in her heart. At first she thought that time would help. Day after day she forced herself to think about something else. But as soon as she was alone, her thoughts would come back to him. Sometimes she found herself looking for his profile on social media, but quickly stopped, realizing that this was only causing herself more pain. She knew it was wrong, but it was impossible to deal with it. One evening, when the city was shrouded in a soft autumn fog, Aya went outside. She was walking aimlessly, just trying to escape from her thoughts. She wandered the streets, watching the passers-by, their ordinary lives, in which there was no place for such complex emotions. People were laughing, talking on the phone, meeting with friends. It all seemed so far from her world. She stopped at the window of the cafe and looked inside. There were couples, friends and families sitting at tables. They lived their own lives, and each had their own story, but none of them was like hers. She looked at those faces, trying to figure out how they could be so happy when her life was crumbling before her eyes. But there was no answer. Aya knew that no escape could make her forget Lucas. This feeling was too strong, too deep, to just disappear. It became a part of her, her shadow that followed her everywhere. At night, when the whole city was already asleep, Aya sat in the silence of her apartment, looking out the window at the lights of distant houses. She tried to convince herself that this was only a temporary condition, that someday she would be able to forget, be able to move on. But every day it became clearer no distance, no new city would relieve her of this pain. Her heart still belonged to Lucas, and no matter how hard she tried, nothing could change that. Aya understood that her life was now divided into before and after, and if before she could find solace in the fact that he was there, now she was left alone with her thoughts and feelings. Her love for Lucas did not disappear, but on the contrary grew stronger every day. But this love was wrong, unacceptable, and it only hurt more. Despite this, Aya continued to live. Each new day was similar to the previous one: work, studies, rare meetings with new acquaintances who did not know her past. but no amount of distraction helped. Her soul remained locked in the past, in a time when everything was simpler. Aya often found herself thinking that if she could go back, she would have acted differently, but it was impossible to return the time.
How did I end up here?
It was a question she asked herself every night, but she never found the answer. From the moment Aya disappeared from his life, Lucas's world seemed to have lost its meaning. It had been several months, but the feeling of emptiness she had left behind was getting stronger every day. He was sitting on the couch in his apartment, surrounded by silence, and could not believe that this had happened. It was like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Lucas stared at a single point on the wall, replaying their last meeting in his head. Aya, his younger sister, the person with whom he always shared his innermost thoughts, just left. No explanation, no real reason. There was pain in her words then, he felt it, but he could not understand what exactly was tormenting her. The conversation in the cafe was in front of his eyes, as if it were yesterday. Her quiet voice, intense gaze, as if she was trying to say something but couldn't find the right words.
Why, Aya?
These words became a refrain for him. He repeated them over and over again, every time he sat alone, when he woke up in a cold sweat at night, when he looked at the empty phone screen, waiting for a message that would not be there. She blocked his number, deleted herself from social media, and left him with this unbearable feeling of emptiness and insecurity. Lucas couldn't figure out what went wrong, what he did, what made her leave. Their bond had always seemed unbreakable, but now it was gone. And he didn't know how to move on. At first, Lucas tried to distract himself, to find solace in the usual things: work, friends, training. But it all became meaningless. More recently, he was making plans, discussing the future with Aya. They talked about where they would go for the weekend or what they would do for the new year. Now these plans were just dust that had settled on the shelves of his memory. The work that used to bring him pleasure has ceased to be important. Every new day began and ended with thoughts of her. Where is she? What's wrong with her? Why didn't she say anything? Lucas continued to go to work, mechanically fulfilling his duties, but his colleagues immediately noticed that something had changed. That confident and cheerful Lucas, who could always keep up a conversation, became silent and detached. He did not talk about his problems, did not share his feelings. It was not in his nature. But others noticed how he began to withdraw into himself, becoming more and more immersed in his thoughts. His friends were trying to bring him back to life. They called, invited to meetings, threw parties, but it was all like noise in the background, unimportant and inconsequential. Lucas smiled when he had to, but inside he felt like everything was falling apart. Even communication with close friends did not bring relief. He tried to explain to them that Aya had just left, that she needed time for herself, but he couldn't tell the whole truth. He didn't know the whole truth. He didn't know the whole truth himself. Time passed, but the pain did not decrease. The expectation of an answer, the hope that Aya would return, slowly turned into despair. He was trying to find her. I wrote to friends, asked acquaintances, but no one knew where she had gone. Her name seemed to disappear from all the lists, from their lives, as if she had never existed. This feeling of helplessness was destroying him from the inside. Every time he didn't get an answer, his heart squeezed harder. It was as if he had lost not only his sister, but also his own life. One evening, sitting on the same couch, Lucas found himself thinking that nothing made sense. He knew he had to move on, but he couldn't. All the talk about letting go and starting over seemed like empty words to him. How can you let go of the person who was your center, your meaning? He had always been sure that their bond was unbreakable, but now he felt betrayed. Aya just left, leaving him no chance to change anything. Every day turned into a torment. He woke up in the morning with a heavy heart and went to bed every night with the same feeling. The moments when he managed to distract himself were short and empty. He was constantly thinking about where she was now, what she was doing. Maybe she found someone? Maybe she's happy where no one else knows her. One day, Lucas decided that he could no longer just sit and wait. He was not a man who gave up easily, and this feeling of helplessness was killing him. He decided that he had to find Aya, no matter how difficult the path was. He began to go over in his memory everything he knew about her habits, about her desires. He remembered that she had always dreamed of living in another city, away from all those places that were associated with their childhood. Aya often talked about Chicago, about its calm and measured atmosphere, which attracted her. Lucas decided that this might be the key.
I have to find her.
This thought became the only way out for him. He could no longer remain in a state of uncertainty. He could not wait for her to contact him herself. He realized that if he didn't find her now, he would lose her forever. But how do you look for a person who doesn't want to be found? It was a question he didn't know the answer to, but he had no choice but to start. At work, he took a vacation, bought a ticket to Chicago, and began to prepare for the search. Lucas didn't know if he would find her, but he couldn't just sit there anymore. There was hope in his heart, even though his mind told him that the chances were slim. He explored all possible places where Aya could settle. I looked through the lists of universities, checked the ads for housing, but found nothing. She was too careful to leave footprints behind. His arrival in Chicago turned out to be as vague and uncertain as his plans. The city seemed alien and unfriendly, and every corner was filled with faces he didn't know. Lucas realized that it would be almost impossible to find her here. But he was determined not to give up. Time passed, and the search remained unsuccessful. He wandered the streets, went into cafes that resembled their favorite place in their hometown. He looked for her in the crowd, hoping for a chance meeting, but she was not there. Several days passed in the same rhythm. Lucas tried to find at least some clue, but to no avail. He was beginning to lose hope, but inside he still believed that sooner or later she would show up. He visited libraries, universities, cafes. I showed her a photo of a barista serving in a cafe, hoping that someone would recognize her, but every time I was faced with uncomprehending looks. One cold evening, when he had almost given up, Lucas entered a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. This place was inconspicuous, hidden from the main streets, and he went there just by accident. There, at one of the far tables, he saw her. Aya was sitting with her face buried in a book, and did not even suspect that anyone could find her. Her face was calm, but there was fatigue in her eyes. Lucas froze in place, not believing his eyes. She was here, right in front of him, after all these months of searching and tormenting.
Aya? Wanna?
His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it contained all the pain that he had been hiding all this time. She raised her head and their eyes met. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. There was surprise mixed with alarm in her eyes. She hadn't expected to see him here, and her reaction only confirmed that she really wanted to disappear from his life.
Lucas.
Her voice was just as quiet, as if she was afraid that any word would destroy this fragile moment. After meeting Lucas in Chicago, Aya felt her life spinning out of control again. The whole year she had spent trying to escape from her feelings suddenly seemed lost. Meeting him awakened in her all those emotions that she tried to suppress, made her realize again how strong and painful her love for her brother was. But Aya understood that she could not afford to plunge back into the abyss from which she had barely escaped. Her move, her decision to disappear, her attempt to start a new life, all this turned out to be useless, because just one look from Lucas opened all the wounds that she had so diligently healed. Returning to her new life in Chicago, Aya felt even more devastated than before. She had a job, a new routine, a new city, but now she realized that no amount of environmental changes would help her get rid of what was happening inside her. Every thought, every action brought her back to Lucas, to their forbidden bond, which she couldn't afford. But it was unbearable to remain in this state. She knew that either she would fall back into the same pit of despair that she had been climbing out of for so long, or she needed to make a drastic change. And then she made a decision. She needed to try to build a new relationship. Aya believed that if she could distract herself, if she could transfer her emotional attachment to someone else, then maybe she could forget Lucas. It wasn't a conscious decision to love someone new, it was a decision to escape from your own feelings. She hoped that if she surrounded herself with someone who could give her care and support, she would at least temporarily find peace. At first, after returning, she threw herself into work. Her office was located in the center of Chicago, among high rises and office buildings, the bustle of big streets and endless crowds of people. It was a new environment that helped her to be distracted, at least for a while. She came to work early and left late, trying to immerse herself in cases, documents and reports, so that she didn't have time to think about Lucas. Colleagues began to notice her diligence, but no one suspected that this was an attempt to escape from herself. However, it was impossible to be distracted by work for a long time. Every evening, returning to her empty apartment, Aya found herself alone with her thoughts again and again. Loneliness became her constant companion, and no matter how she tried to fill the void with new things and tasks, her feelings for Lucas did not weaken. They were just hiding deep inside, waiting for the moment when they could reappear. One day, Aya realized that if she did not change something in her personal life, she would collapse again under the weight of these emotions. The appearance of a new person in her life was an unexpected, but at the same time a logical step. One of her colleagues was Michael, a man who had been interested in her from the very beginning of her work in the office. He was a few years older, confident, with a slight smile and a calmness that attracted others. Michael was one of those who always knows what to say to keep the conversation going, who is not afraid to joke and flirt, but does it with dignity. He had been paying attention to Aya for a long time, but she was too withdrawn to respond to his attentions. However, after meeting Lucas, when her inner world began to crumble again, Aya realized that Michael could be the one to help her restore balance. He didn't look like Lucas, and that was important to her. Aya was looking for someone who would not remind her of her brother, who would become a new page for her, and not a continuation of an old story. Michael turned out to be just such a person. Their communication began with simple, friendly conversations at work. Aya tried not to show too much interest, but Michael was persistent. He invited her to dinners, offered to help with chores, tried to be there for her when it was hard. Gradually, Aya began to notice that his presence had become a kind of salvation for her. She felt that Michael was trying to understand her, even though he didn't know all the details of her life. He didn't need to know about Lucas to be the one to help her forget about the past. After a few weeks, their communication became more personal. Michael started inviting her to dinners, offering to take a walk after work. Aya hesitated at first, but then decided that this might be her chance. She started dating Michael, hoping that this relationship could help her deal with what she felt for Lucas. Michael was caring and attentive, and Aya tried to be grateful for his attention. He didn't press her, didn't demand revelations, but she felt that he sincerely wanted to be with her. At first, their meetings were easy and casual. Michael was able to create an atmosphere of comfort, and it helped Aya relax. She began to think that maybe she could build a normal relationship with him, that Michael would be the person for her to forget about Lucas. He was different, calm, confident, without those sharp angles that had always been between her and her brother. He didn't make her feel pain or guilt, but on the contrary, he helped her to distract herself from all this. But despite all her efforts, Aya couldn't get rid of the inner feeling that her feelings for Michael were superficial. She knew she was pretending that her affection for him was more an attempt to forget about her brother than true love. Michael was kind and attentive, but every time they spent time together, Aya found herself comparing him to Lucas, and each time the comparison was not in Michael's favor. Gradually, Aya began to notice that their meetings were becoming more of a duty for her than a joy. She didn't feel the spark she was looking for. Michael was reliable and stable, but her heart remained deaf to his concern. His every gesture, every word seemed right to her, but at the same time alien. She tried to convince herself that she would eventually be able to love him, that it was only a matter of time, but her inner world remained full of doubts. Every day their relationship became more strained. Michael began to notice her detachment, her disinterest in their meetings. He didn't tell her about it directly, but Aya could see that he could feel her cold. It wasn't intentional. She tried to be sincere with him, but her heart wouldn't respond. Every time Michael tried to approach her, she involuntarily pulled away, as if she was building an invisible wall between them. Several months have passed since the beginning of their relationship, and Aya realized that she could no longer pretend. She couldn't keep deceiving Michael, couldn't be with him, knowing that she would never be able to truly love him. Her feelings for Lucas had not disappeared, and no new relationship could change that fact. She understood that Michael deserved more, someone who could give him sincere love and devotion. Aya, on the other hand, could offer him nothing but an attempt to forget about her brother. The decision to end the relationship was difficult, but necessary. Aya thought about this step for a long time, not knowing how to do the right thing. She didn't want to hurt Michael, because he really was a good man. But the continuation of this relationship became unbearable for her. She felt guilty about him, about herself, and even about Lucas. All her attempts to escape from her feelings were in vain. Finally, she decided that she had to be honest. One evening, when they were sitting in a cafe, Aya gathered her strength and told Michael that she could no longer continue this relationship. It was a difficult conversation, but she knew it had to be done. Michael accepted her decision with dignity, although it was obvious that he was in pain. He had long felt her detachment and understood that something was wrong between them. Aya did not explain everything to him in detail, did not talk about Lucas. It was her personal struggle, and she didn't want to involve Michael in this story. After the breakup with Michael, Aya was left alone again. She realized that no new relationship could stifle her feelings for Lucas. Michael was just a temporary distraction, an attempt to find peace in someone else's arms, but her heart remained true to the one she couldn't have. This realization was painful, but it gave her an understanding that her attempts to escape from herself were doomed to failure from the very beginning. Now that the relationship with Michael is over, Aya finds herself facing the same choice as a year ago. She could keep trying to forget about Lucas, or she needed to change something in her life. It's been exactly a year since Aya made one of the most difficult decisions of her life to sever all ties with Lucas and leave. This year turned out to be both an emotional torture for her and a time when she was trying to find herself. Since she left her hometown, leaving behind all the memories of her family, brother and their difficult relationship, her life has turned into a series of attempts to move on. Aya threw all her strength into starting a new life in Chicago, both physically and emotionally, but all this time she carried unhealed wounds. At first, Aya believed that time could heal her mental injuries, that with each new day her feelings for Lucas would weaken, as is usually the case with past relationships. She hoped that her attachment to him, as well as her inner struggle, would disappear as she moved away from him both physically and emotionally. But despite the move, the new job, even the attempt to build a relationship with Michael, her heart was still in chaos. Feelings for my brother have not disappeared, they have not gone away, and have not weakened. They became a part of her being, something she had to live with, even if she tried to ignore it. Aya got used to the routine of her new life in Chicago, but behind this external stabilization there was still the same internal struggle. She worked, tried to be as busy as possible, attended training sessions, met with colleagues, and sometimes even participated in some social events. However, every evening when she returned to her apartment, she was left alone with her thoughts again. Her apartment, although comfortable and equipped for comfort, was cold and devoid of what would make it a home. She didn't feel safe or at peace here because she knew that her heart was in the past, in her hometown, somewhere near Lucas. Over time, Aya realized that running away didn't solve her problems. She couldn't forget Lucas, no matter how hard she tried. All her attempts to repress her feelings proved futile, and she continued to live in a state of emotional isolation. The same contradictory feelings were still boiling inside her: love, guilt, fear. At some point, she realized that she might never be able to completely free herself from this burden. The year flew by unnoticed. One part of her life was immersed in work and business, the other remained in the shadows, imprisoned in the past. Each new day seemed to her the same as the previous one. Everything flowed in the same rhythm: the subway, the office, training, grocery shopping, rare meetings with colleagues. At first she felt like she was in a cocoon in this routine, which protected her from pain, but soon realized that this cocoon had become her prison. It seemed to her that she was stuck in an endless circle of monotony, and no external changes could change her inner state. Autumn, which brought coolness to Chicago, also became a time for Aya when she increasingly thought that it was time for her to return to her hometown. And not because she missed home or people, it was something deeper. She felt that she needed to go back to finally close this painful issue with Lucas. The internal conflict was still gnawing at her, and the longer she put off facing the past, the more intense her suffering became. One day, she received an invitation to a family event, their parents' wedding anniversary. It was an event that Aya couldn't ignore. Every year, their entire extended family gathered together to celebrate this date, and the absence of one of the children was always perceived as something strange. Aya understood that if she didn't come, it would cause too many questions from her relatives, and they were the last thing she wanted right now. At the same time, she knew that Lucas would be at this event. His presence would rekindle the feelings she had tried so hard to bury this year, but it was impossible to avoid this meeting. The anniversary was an important family event, and its absence would be a signal that something was wrong. Aya thought for a long time about what to do, but eventually decided to go. She understood that sooner or later she would have to face the past, and it was impossible to avoid it anymore. Being face to face with Lucas again was scary, but also inevitable. This fear did not leave her all the days before the trip, but Aya knew that now she had to be strong. You can't run away anymore. The journey home was painful for her. The city that used to seem so familiar has now become a stranger. Every street, every corner was a reminder of the days when she and Lucas were inseparable. memories piled up one after another, and Aya could hardly contain her emotions. The same anxiety that had been visiting her so often lately began to grow inside her again. She had a meeting with Lucas ahead of her, and although she didn't know how he felt now, the thought of having to see him again made her heart ache with pain and anticipation. When she arrived home, her parents greeted her joyfully, as if nothing had happened, as if this year of torment had never existed. For them, Aya was a daughter who just went to another city to build her life, and they didn't know anything about what was going on inside her. This allowed her to hold her face and pretend that everything was fine, although every look at family photos, every conversation about her childhood only intensified her inner struggle. On the day of the family holiday, Aya felt like she was going to be executed. Parents and relatives have already gathered at the country house, where such events have always been held. The noise of conversation, laughter, and lightness of the atmosphere seemed to contrast with her inner state. She tried to keep up conversations, smile, answer questions, but her whole being was focused on waiting for the moment when she would see Lucas. Deep down, she knew that their meeting was inevitable, but she did not know how to withstand it. Lucas arrived later than the others. When Aya saw him, her heart stopped. Time seemed to have stopped. He was the same as she remembered him, but there was something new in his gaze, something that said that this year had changed him as much as it had changed her. He was restrained, friendly, but behind this external calmness there were emotions that she immediately recognized. Aya avoided looking into his eyes, tried to keep her distance, but every time they happened to be near, her breathing quickened and her thoughts became confused. Lucas noticed her tension too. He seemed to be trying to give her space, but at the same time his presence was palpable. Their unspoken bond, despite all their efforts, did not disappear. She was just waiting in the wings to remind herself of herself again. And now the hour has come. Throughout the evening, Aya felt like everything inside her was preparing for some crucial moment. As the evening drew to a close, Aya could no longer stay in the house. She went outside to get some fresh air and calm her nerves. It was quiet outside. The lanterns were shining all around, and a light breeze brought cold air with it. She leaned against the railing of the terrace and closed her eyes, trying to cope with the hurricane of emotions that raged inside her. Lucas followed her. She felt his presence long before she heard his footsteps. As he approached, the silence between them became almost palpable. It wasn't their first silent encounter, but now, after everything that had happened, it felt different. There was more to this silence than just words. There were so many things they hadn't said to each other this year. Words lost their meaning because feelings spoke for them. They both stood on the terrace, lost in their thoughts, and it seemed that this moment could last forever. Something broke inside Aya. She could no longer run away from this pain, from these feelings. And although she didn't know what she would say or do next, one thing became obvious to her: this meeting was just the beginning. The beginning of something that could change everything, but what exactly, Aya couldn't know. After that fateful meeting with Lucas on a family holiday, Aya returned to Chicago with even more confusion than before. Meeting her brother, who for a year remained a ghost of her past, completely knocked her off balance. Aya understood that a lot had changed this year, but one thing remained unchanged: her feelings for Lucas were still just as strong, if not stronger. She couldn't ignore this fact no matter how hard she tried. Trying to build a new life, a new relationship, and forget about what had happened between them now seemed naive and useless to her. When Aya returned to Chicago, her internal struggle escalated to the limit. Michael, her new partner, had long suspected that something was wrong. Their relationship, which at first seemed like an opportunity for her to find salvation, began to crumble long before this trip. But after returning from her hometown, Aya became even more detached and withdrawn. Michael, although he was a patient and empathetic person, could not help but notice that there was more and more distance between them. He tried not to ask unnecessary questions, hoping that she would come to him with an explanation, but Aya was too confused in her feelings to open up to him. Michael was the one who gave Aya a chance to start a new life, who tried to fill the void she carried inside herself after breaking up with Lucas. He was kind, reliable, attentive, all the things that seemed to help Aya forget about the past. But instead of being a salvation for her, Michael turned into a reminder that her heart did not belong to him. With each passing day, Aya realized more and more that her feelings for Michael could not compare to what she felt for Lucas. And the more she tried to ignore it, the stronger her inner conflict became. After returning from her hometown, Aya felt as if she was divided. On the one hand, she tried to convince herself that she had to continue her relationship with Michael, that this was the right step, that he cared about her and could give her the stability she so lacked. On the other hand, every moment she spent with him only increased her pain and guilt. Her heart did not respond to his caresses, his words, his attempts to get closer to her. His every touch seemed alien to her, and she felt more and more that she was betraying not only Michael, but also herself. Aya found herself thinking back to Lucas more and more often. The memories of her brother became even brighter after that meeting, and every time she was with Michael, her thoughts invariably drifted into the past. It created unbearable tension. She tried to maintain the appearance of a normal relationship, but her every gesture, every word became more and more mechanical. Michael could feel it, and although he tried not to push her, the tension between them was building. The job that used to be a refuge for Aya has now become a source of additional stress. It was becoming increasingly difficult for her to concentrate on tasks, and each new task seemed too much for her. She began to come to work more tired and annoyed, and her results began to drop. Aya understood that her internal conflict was destroying not only her personal life, but also her professional one. Colleagues began to notice her detachment, but no one dared to ask directly what was happening to her. Gradually, Aya became more and more withdrawn into herself. Her meetings with Michael became rare, and even when they were together, she tried to avoid too deep conversations. She couldn't tell him what was going on in her soul, couldn't admit that her heart belonged to another person, and even more so that this person was her brother. She felt like she was ruining their relationship, but she couldn't do anything about it. Michael, in turn, began to feel a growing alienation. He saw that Aya was no longer open to him, that she was withdrawing more and more into herself. At first he tried to support her, not to push her, but over time his patience began to run out. He didn't understand what was going on, and this only increased his frustration. It seemed to him that Aya was hiding something, that she was struggling with something important, but could not share it with him. Michael tried to have frank conversations, but each time Aya skillfully evaded the answers, which further deepened the gap between them. One day, when they were having dinner together, the tension reached its peak. Aya hardly ate, her thoughts were far away, and Michael, feeling this, could not stand it and began to ask questions. He asked her directly what was going on, why she had become so detached, why she avoided conversations and meetings. Aya understood that she couldn't continue this relationship anymore, but she still couldn't find the strength to tell the truth. She couldn't explain to Michael that her whole life, all her feelings, were locked in one person she couldn't have. Michael was too good a man to deserve such pain. He really cared about her, tried to be there for her, to support her, but Aya knew she couldn't give him what he wanted. She felt guilty that she had continued this relationship, knowing that she could not be truly sincere with him. Every new day with Michael was a challenge for her, because she saw how hard he was trying, but her heart remained cold. For several weeks after that conversation, the relationship between them hung in the balance. Aya understood that Michael was expecting an explanation from her, that he wanted to know why she had become so distant. But she couldn't tell him anything. Her feelings for Lucas had grown even stronger, and no new relationship could change that fact. Each new meeting with Michael turned into torment. She felt that she was deceiving him, that she was betraying their relationship, and this feeling intensified her inner struggle. Aya soon realized that she could no longer continue this deception. Her relationship with Michael was built on false hopes, on trying to numb her pain and forget about the past, but it all turned out to be useless. She couldn't love him the way he deserved to be loved. It hurt her that she had to hurt him, but she knew that continuing this relationship would be unfair to both of them. The decision to break off relations with Michael was inevitable, but Aya could not find the strength to take this step for a long time. She was tormented by the thought that she would destroy something that could have been good. But she also understood that if she continued to live in this state, she would completely lose herself. Her inner conflict became so unbearable that every morning when she woke up, she felt the weight of this decision hanging over her. Finally, one evening when they met after work, Aya decided it was time to end this relationship. She knew that Michael didn't deserve to be a part of this struggle that was going on inside her. They were sitting at a table in her apartment, and the atmosphere was tense. Aya gathered all her strength to tell him that she could no longer continue the relationship. She didn't go into details, didn't explain to him everything that was going on in her soul, but Michael understood her without words. After she told him of her decision, silence fell between them. Michael was disappointed, but he had long felt that this relationship would not last. He didn't know what exactly Aya was hiding from him, but he could see that her heart belonged to someone else. He was wise enough not to ask too many questions and sensitive enough to understand her. Their breakup was painful, but inevitable. They both understood that their relationship was doomed from the very beginning. After that evening, Michael left her life as quietly as he had appeared. They didn't see each other anymore, and Aya was left alone with her thoughts and feelings. She knew she had made the right choice, but it did not bring her relief. Now that her relationship with Michael was over, her heart finally returned to Lucas. She realized that no new relationship could help her forget how she felt about her brother. This year was spent trying to escape from herself, but in the end she returned to the same place where she started. Now Aya faced an even more difficult choice. Her attempt to start a new life had failed, and she needed to decide what to do next. After Aya broke off her relationship with Michael and was left alone with herself, it became clear to her that her attempts to escape from her feelings for Lucas were in vain. She had tried many times to convince herself that loving her own brother was something that could be suppressed, forgotten, or replaced. However, now, after all her attempts to build a normal relationship had failed, she had to admit to herself that the feeling she had for Lucas had not disappeared, despite all her efforts. Aya's been trying to avoid this truth for a long time. All attempts to distract oneself work, moving new relationships turned out to be only temporary ways to hide real emotions. But every time she was alone, these feelings surfaced. Her love for Lucas was deeper than she was willing to admit. She could not be drowned out by new impressions or go so far as to forget him. It was a part of her very being, something that couldn't just be erased from her life. When the relationship with Michael ended, Aya began to realize that further escape from her feelings for Lucas did not make sense. Throughout the year she spent away from him, her heart remained attached to the moment when she realized that her love for him went beyond brotherly. It became clear to her that now that she had done everything possible to build a new life, she no longer had the opportunity and desire to continue running away. These realizations became a turning point for Aya. Before, it was easier for her to think that all this could be fixed, that her feelings were a temporary insanity that would pass by itself. But now she knew that wasn't the case. She no longer had any illusions her love for Lucas was not just an emotional outburst, but something much deeper and more lasting than she could have imagined. And now that there was no need to pretend to herself and others anymore, Aya realized that the only way forward was to admit her feelings and make a choice, no matter how difficult it might be. However, it is one thing to realize your love, and quite another to figure out what to do with it next. Aya thought about it for a long time. She understood that a relationship with Lucas was not just an emotional or moral challenge. It was a step that could destroy their lives, bring pain and suffering not only to them, but also to their family. Society, environment, friends, all these people will never understand and accept that Aya and Lucas decided to be together. And yet, despite these fears, she felt that she could no longer ignore her heart. One of the most difficult parts of this decision was the realization that admitting her feelings to Lucas would be tantamount to stepping into the abyss. She knew that if she opened up to him, it could change everything, their relationship, their lives. She could lose him forever if he rejected her confession. But at the same time, Aya understood that if she continued to live in a state of suppressed emotions, she would completely destroy herself. Her life had become empty without Lucas, and she couldn't live in that emptiness anymore. Aya had been preparing for a long time to talk to Lucas. She wasn't sure if he felt the same way, although there was hope in her soul. Their last meeting on a family holiday had given her reason to think that he too felt something more than brotherly affection for her. His look, his behavior, all this indicated that he too was going through something deep and painful. But how do you know if he is ready for this? Is he ready to admit his feelings? Or had he already accepted that they could never be together? Finally, after much thought, Aya decided that she needed to talk to Lucas. It wasn't easy, but she realized that she couldn't live in a state of uncertainty anymore. She needed to know the truth, even if it turned out to be painful. She knew it was a risk, a huge risk, but it was the only way out. It was impossible to live in constant struggle with oneself. Aya chose a neutral place to meet, their old cafe, where they often sat together when everything was simpler and more innocent. This place was a symbol of peace and friendship for them, and she hoped that this choice would help ease the conversation. Her heart was beating so hard that she thought she could hear it beating in her ears when she entered the cafe and saw Lucas at the table. Lucas, as always, looked calm, but there was anxiety in his eyes. He had been waiting for this conversation, as had she. Aya noticed how he tensed when he saw her, but made no move to hide his feelings. Their eyes met in silence, and there was more in that silence than words could express. Aya gathered all her courage to start a conversation. She knew that this would be the most difficult moment in her life, but she understood that if she didn't do it now, she would never be able to free herself from the pain that she carried inside herself. She began to speak, and with every word she uttered, it became easier for her. Her heart was open, and she no longer tried to hide her feelings. She told Lucas everything about how long she had been fighting with herself, how she had tried to forget him, how she had tried to build a new life. But nothing had helped. She spoke for a long time, not looking into his eyes, afraid to see his reaction. Aya knew she could lose him forever, but this was the only chance to tell the truth. She told him about her love, about how she suffered because this love was forbidden, but at the same time she could not control it. When she finished, there was a heavy silence in the cafe. Lucas was silent for a long time. He was looking at her, and Aya couldn't understand what he was feeling. Her heart was beating so hard that it seemed like it was about to stop. But instead of rejecting her, Lucas started talking. He told her about how he felt all this time, about how he also tried to fight his feelings, how he didn't know how to do the right thing. He was afraid that if he opened up, he would lose her forever, and that's why he also chose the path of silence. Lucas confessed that his love for her was as painful as hers. He also tried to start a new life, to forget it, but nothing helped. Every attempt seemed futile to him, because his heart always returned to Aya. This year was as empty for him as it was for her. He realized that their feelings were mutual, and the realization came as a shock to both of them. None of them expected that the truth would be so devastating, and at the same time, liberating. Now that everything was said, Aya and Lucas were faced with a choice that would change their lives. They both understood that the relationship between them could not be accepted by society or their family. Their love was forbidden, and any steps towards being together would be met with condemnation and rejection. They will have to live in constant shadow, hiding their feelings from everyone. It was a huge risk, and they both knew it. But despite all their fears and misgivings, they realized that they could no longer continue to live pretending that their feelings did not exist. They were both willing to take this risk because their love was stronger than any inhibitions. It was their decision to give these feelings a chance, despite all the consequences. Aya and Lucas decided that they would no longer live in denial of their emotions. They knew that difficulties awaited them, but they also knew that they could cope with them if they were together. It was the most difficult decision of their lives, but now that all the cards were out, they were determined to go all the way. There was an unknown ahead of them, but they were ready for it, because they understood that their love was worth fighting for. Now Aya and Lucas were no longer alone in their struggle. They decided to give their feelings a chance, despite all the risks. They had a long and difficult road ahead of them, but they were ready to walk it together.